Good evening and welcome to tonight's public meeting of the 2019 New York City Charter Revision Commission. I'm Gail Benjamin, the chair of the commission, and I am joined by the following members. The Honorable Sal Albanese on my far left, the Honorable Jim Karras on my near left, the Honorable Lisette Camillo on my south side, I believe, the Honorable Paula Gavin on my near right, the Honorable Allison Hirsch on Beauty Before Age on my far right, and in between the two of them, the Honorable James Vaca. Below, to my southeast, is the Honorable Carl Weisbrod, and to his east is the Honorable Satish Nuri. With these commissioners present, we have a quorum. Before I begin, I will entertain a motion to adopt the minutes of the Commission's meeting held on March 18th here at City Hall, a copy of which has been provided to all of the commissioners. Do I hear a motion? Second? Discussion? All in favor? Opposed? The motion carries. Did somebody say psst to me? Today we will continue the Commission's series of expert forums on the focus areas we adopted in January. This evening we are privileged to be joined by a very distinguished set of panelists put together in consultation with my fellow commissioners, and they have generously agreed to speak to us about several land use related topics, including ULURP and comprehensive planning. How the city makes decisions relating to the use of land, one of its most limited resources, is critically important to our future. The Commission has received many ideas for reforms of the ULURP process, which governs many of the important land use decisions that are made in the city. We have also heard a lot about improving the city's approach to setting out a comprehensive approach to future growth and development that takes into account various competing needs and priorities. We are very much looking forward to engaging with our panelists on these important issues. As you can see, we have a lot to get to this evening, so let's get started with our first panel, which will be discussing ULURP. Each panelist will have 3 minutes to introduce themselves and provide brief opening remarks, and then we'll have 30 minutes for commissioner questions. It's a large group, so it may be more than 30 minutes. If, however, there is not enough time and you still have questions, please let staff know, and they will arrange for follow-up afterward. On the first panel, and you might want to just indicate who you are, we have Marissa Lago, current chair, Anita Lermont, Vishan Chakrabarti, Andrew Lin, Joe Rose, former chair, and Carmen Vega Rivera. Who would like to start? Go ahead, Marissa.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm Marissa Lago. I'm the director of the Department of City Planning and chair of the City Planning Commission. My remarks are going to focus on 2 topics: the importance of continuing to rely on as-of-right development to meet the needs of our growing city, and the necessity of having a workable ULURP process to create needed housing. In New York, unlike other large industrial-era U.S. cities, we're at an all-time high in both population and jobs. In 2000, we reached our previous peak set in 1970. Since then, we've added over 700,000 people, an entire city of Seattle, and we've become more ethnically diverse, and we're continuing to grow. If we can't continue to make room for immigrants, for our children, and for future generations of New Yorkers, we'll fail to meet the needs of our most vulnerable residents, and we'll cease to be the diverse and welcoming city that has defined us through history. As-of-right development is the lifeblood of our built environment. We should not threaten it by increasing the number and type of land use actions that are subject to ULURP. Over 80% of the new housing produced since 2000 has been built as of right. Without this development, approximately 300,000 New Yorkers and entire Pittsburgh wouldn't have the homes in which they live today. If, as in San Francisco, every property had to go through discretionary land use review, the number of housing units in our city would be less, markedly increasing the pressure on our most vulnerable residents. The existence of a sound, workable ULURP process is indispensable to creating the capacity for future as-of-right development and to supporting the production of permanently affordable housing. Since 2000, about 30% of the new housing that has been built occurred as of right following a ULURP-approved neighborhood rezoning that had increased the amount of housing that could be built. An additional 20% of new housing has come through ULURP as site-specific actions. About half of that is through applications by private landowners, and about half through projects sponsored by the city. These city projects are typically 100% affordable housing, underscoring the fact that producing affordable housing relies on a workable ULURP process. The ULURP process is premised on local input. It gives community boards the opportunities to weigh in first during public review, and it culminates in the City Council, enabling the local council member to play a key role in the final decision. But to ensure that land use decisions promote a more equitable city, these local community perspectives must be balanced with broader citywide views, such as the need to site necessary infrastructure and to meet the housing needs of future generations of New Yorkers. Creating enough housing for our growing population is fundamental to addressing displacement pressures in neighborhoods. If I might, I have just one more point I'd like to make. Thank you, Chair. Some express concerns that low-income neighborhoods bear the brunt of most new housing development. I share the passion for equity that underlies these concerns, but this administration's policies are, in practice, promoting equity by producing housing in high-opportunity neighborhoods. Since 2005, the largest share of new housing production, a full 36%, has occurred in the 25% of neighborhoods with the highest median income, and about 1/3 of new affordable housing that's been completed under Mayor de Blasio's Housing New York plan was built in these same high-income neighborhoods. My written testimony goes on to address additional topics, but in the interest of time, I'll thank you for the additional moments and end here.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to take a minute as chair to acknowledge that Commissioner Cordero and Commissioner Paoli have both arrived, and to ask if they would like to join in voting on the adoption of the minutes from the 18th.
Yes.
So noted. Anita, would you like to go next?
Good evening, Commissioners. I'm Anita Laramont. I'm the Executive Director of the Department of City Planning. Together with community boards, ULURP was established in 1975 as part of a set of charter revisions that discarded top-down master planning and established a locally responsive land use decision-making process. ULURP was amended in 1989. It was then that the City Council's role was expanded to amplify the voice of communities in the city's land use process. ULURP today has 3 essential ingredients: balance, predictability, and transparency. Balance ensures that both neighborhood and citywide perspectives are given weight in the ULURP process. Community boards and borough presidents comment first, ensuring that decisions are informed early on by local perspectives. Decisions are made by entities, the City Planning Commission and the City Council, with responsibilities to the whole city. Decisions are informed, but we hope not dominated by local voice. Balance also refers to the shared power of the executive and the City Council that emerges from ULURP. The 1989 charter gave the executive a 1-vote majority on the commission, but it gave the City Council the final word on every ULURP application. The council itself balances its role as a citywide body against its practice of giving a dominant voice to the local member on land use matters. As such, local perspectives and the views of the council are strongly represented and increasingly decisive in ULURP. While some local voices feel that the ULURP process does not give them a strong enough voice, we hear from affordable housing developers, fair housing advocates, and others who see that local concerns are frequently winning out over the wider needs of families, immigrants, and others among the city's most vulnerable. Predictability refers to access to the process with a finite timeline. This 7-month process provides opportunities to elicit and consider information that can and does affect the outcome, up to and including the decision of whether or not to approve a project. ULURP ensures that the city cannot, as in Chicago, sit on applications forever, nor can the city rush projects through in a week. We strongly urge caution around proposals that would allow non-applicants to introduce amended applications during ULURP, or that would significantly broaden changes that can be made at the very end of the process. This will undermine predictability and deter many from entering ULURP in the first place. Transparency refers to ULURP's requirements for public notice and information. The process informs the public and ensures the rights of all parties, including applicants, to due process and the opportunity to be heard on changes that may affect them. In making its decisions, the Commission responds to all relevant comments and elaborates on the grounds for its decisions in a public report. We see this basic process as sound and caution just a few more lines. And caution strongly against changes that undermine its balance and predictability. We are, however, mindful of ways to make the process more transparent. We are already making more information easily accessible to the public earlier on in the process. Among our many new transparency tools, I will simply point to our ZAP portal, which maps all applications and will soon make full applications available to all online. We commit to working towards even greater transparency as we move forward. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Anita. Andy, or would you like to?
That's fine.
Okay. Mr. Lynn.
Thank you for inviting me to come here tonight. I've participated in the land use process in a number of roles as attorney in private practice, lawyer for the 1989 charter revision, land use counsel to the city council, executive director of the city planning department, work with a private company allied with the community to oppose a major facility the city wanted, and director of planning at the Port Authority. I'm now at WSP, a global engineering firm. The starting point of this charter revision is strikingly different from where things stood in 1989. That effort was a fundamental restructuring of city government after the Supreme Court found the Board of Estimate unconstitutional. Because it came from the top down, the Commission's deliberations proceeded from first principles to specific process. In the ULURP, the Commission sought a balance between the executive and the legislative, the citywide and the local, the professional and the political. The current reform effort is driven by ideas largely proposed by people immersed in the process, many of them feeling varying levels of frustration. If there's a general theme, it might be multiple stakeholders who want a larger bite of the apple. It is not surprising that in the contentious land use arena, a variety of participants think there is need for improvement. A properly balanced process for deciding controversial issues will leave many people with somewhat less than what they want. The challenge for you is to find the right framework for evaluating these proposals. Often on land use matters, there is a vocal local minority directly affected by an action whose interests may conflict with those of a larger, quieter, citywide constituency that has a stake in the action and others like it, but may not show up at the hearing. It will be important to get beyond the voices of the impassioned few to understand the interests of the many. This seems particularly true at a time when the city faces a dawning array of citywide challenges, many of which play out incrementally in bits and pieces in the land use process. Examples include the need to repair and build affordable housing at a scale not seen in decades, the need to generate jobs, particularly for those at or near the poverty level, the need to address sea level rise, storm surge, and climate change. My suggestion is that you focus on how the proposed charter changes would affect the ability of the city to take action on big citywide priorities. Think about who in city government should be responsible and accountable for addressing these challenges. Be mindful that the more inclusive the decision-making, the more difficult it becomes for city leaders to advance a defined vision and for voters to hold leadership accountable. Look at the makeup of the MTA board and its difficulties if you need an example of muddied accountability. Consider whether each proposed charter change might unintentionally do harm. Will it make the process longer, more complicated, more expensive, more vulnerable to legal challenge? Most fundamentally, how will the proposed change affect the action needed on the big issues? Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Commissioner Rose.
Thank
Have
you
you forgotten how to turn the mic on?
Well, it's, turning the mic on, staying to 3 minutes, this is all, the irony is all deeply appreciated. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you. My name is Joe Rose, former chairman of the City Planning Commission and director of the Department of City Planning. I've also served as community board chair for 3 years for Manhattan's Community Board 5. I've been an applicant in ULURP. I've played every role, or many of the roles in this in the ULURP process over the last 36 years. For the last decade, I've been working with cities around the country, mayors and legislatures, working on land use procedures and with the goal, in conjunction with National League of Cities and the Urban Land Institute, to work on excellence in land use decision making, because that's where the real action happens. I agree with many of the things that have been, or almost everything that's been said by my colleagues and predecessors here, and no doubt with some of the things that will be said. And I know the time is short and there's a lot to say. I'm going to just go with some bullet points, and we can go into them greater in depth if you want on some of the issues that you actually called out. I think establishing a pre-ULURP mechanism would be a mistake. I think that the defined time periods of ULURP make sense. The problem of having pre-negotiated things that already appear with everybody signing on in advance actually detracts from the opportunity for a full public discussion. All materials should be available to be reviewed in the process, but actually having some kind of prior negotiation period, I think, is problematic. I think a parallel application process that was mentioned in some of the materials for borough presidents or others to have companion alternative pieces would make a potentially confusing process even more confusing. So streamlining, I think, makes sense. I agree with the notion of requiring accountability and reporting on mitigation requirements that have appeared on applications. That's something that needs to be done. Follow-up and accountability critically important. In terms of the time of the ULURP process, I think the time generally works well, but there are certain kinds of applications that either because of their complexity, the various numerous moving parts of them, or sometimes just the outright controversy, requires a little more time at the community level. And rather than have every application be granted additional time, I think there should be a process where, by petition, a community board can apply for an extra 30 days for an additional hearing or an additional discussion. I don't think that would be problematic, and in some places would simplify and be warranted. In terms of the universe of projects that are covered under ULURP, I think it's by and large correct, except I do think some of the individual dispositions, I'll be quick, wrap it up, some of the individual dispositions of small properties for pursuant to zoning for affordable housing can be taken out. It would still require probably council approval, but there's no reason to require, I think, a full ULURP process for individual properties that don't meet a certain threshold. I think the staying within scope and having that scope in terms of modifications in the process is extremely important. The hyper-politicization of land use decisions is a real danger. It's why the Planning Commission was created in the first place in the 1930s, and the power was taken away from the Board of Estimate. I think that it's appropriate for the council to play an active role, but it should be within parameters as established by scope. But at the same time, in terms of the major-minor modification issue, I think the criteria used are basically sound ones. Now, in terms of what the threshold for what is automatically what goes to the council and what doesn't, but there are issues, especially regarding expired urban renewal plans, where there's such a disparity between what was approved and what needs to be, what subsequent requests are, that there are things that, once again, at a certain threshold, do warrant perhaps automatic referral to the City Council. And then in closing, I just say there are two areas that they're not directly related to ULURP, but they involve circumventing ULURP and sometimes are taken as flaws of ULURP. The Board of Standards and Appeals and the administration of the zoning resolution by the Buildings Department are areas that I think you really need to look at. The City Planning Department drafts and the City Planning Commission adopts the zoning, but the Building Department administers and interprets and enforces it, and there's a big gap. I think a lot of the problems, especially in terms of air right transfers, what's permissible and not permissible within the parameters of ULURP, things like mechanical space violations, if you had the City Planning Department and Commission playing a more active role in the enforcement and interpretation of the zoning and overseeing BSA's actions, you would have a lot less problems than we now have. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Rose. Mr. Chakrabarty.
Good evening. My name is Vishan Chakrabarty. I'm an architect and planner, a professor at Columbia, and the former director of the Manhattan office for the New York DCP in the years following 9/11. I'm testifying tonight as a private citizen. I've reviewed many of the proposed changes to the land use section of the Charter and must respectfully oppose the calls for significant revisions to ULURP, including the proposal for additional layers of so-called comprehensive planning. While the intention of trying to improve equity and affordability is laudable, I'm convinced these proposals would do the exact opposite because they would hinder our capacity to serve our population growth and diversify our economy. The statue in our harbor cannot say, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, but only after we're done with our analysis paralysis. Our lack of affordability does not stem from ULURP. To the contrary, ULURP works because it has the wholly democratic tendency to make everyone somewhat unhappy, which is the hallmark of balance. Many meritorious projects have gone through ULURP with community support, such as Domino or Essex Crossing, both of which I was involved with, and we hope to achieve similar results with our plan for over 2,000 affordable housing units at the Christian Cultural Center. New York's lack of affordability stems from a far simpler issue. The demand for housing in our city wildly outstrips our supply. We are outpacing our growth projections, but given our land scarcity, we simply can't keep up unless we expand the production of both affordable and market rate housing. The fantasy that less growth will lead to equity is irresponsible rhetoric that willfully ignores both our population projections and our history as a city of welcoming newcomers. Part of the role of our elected executive branch is to plan for future New Yorkers, a role that would be a conflict of interest for council members who by definition must instead protect the interests of their local constituents. This is why the authority to plan for New York's growth firmly rests with the mayor's office and should continue to do so. The most successful cities around the world are the ones in which mayors can take strong actions to address social ills, infrastructure, and climate change. We now face an existential threat from climate change, which is why we should not confront that with years of infighting about process just as Rome burns. As a planner, I believe in concepts like strategic planning, but worry that a cumbersome comprehensive plan every decade would not be agile enough to meet our dynamic needs. As the mayor's office illustrated with their recent resilience proposal for Lower Manhattan, the function of depoliticized planning rests with our elected executive branch, which is already obligated under current law to solicit local input and obtain binding council approval. My experience after 9/11 taught me that today's concerns of gentrification and congestion may well give way to unforeseen challenges as our climate changes and our infrastructure fails. So rather than retrench, the times require us to do what our predecessors did, to have the temerity to build an infrastructure of opportunity that will create both social mobility and environmental resilience in this city that we love. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Vega?
Hi, good evening. My name is Carmen Vega Rivera, and I'm a tenant leader with the CASA, Community Actions for Safe Apartment, as well as a member of Thriving Communities. Due to the Jerome Avenue rezoning, my experience with the land use process in ULURP were extremely frustrating as a community member. Some of the problems that currently exist is that there isn't a regular or a public process in place to make changes to the seeker manual, which allow the city to ignore a comprehensive analysis of displacement. Many residents, including myself, had concerns about the city's analysis of residential displacement, but our concerns were often dismissed on the account that the hearings were about the proposed study and not the proposed methodology. Some examples were that the secret manual excluded the consideration of illegal displacement tactics. Therefore, the city did not appropriately assess the displacement pressures for tenants. It also excluded an analysis of legal tactics that landlords currently use to displace tenants. In addition, the manual directs that a detailed assessment of direct residential displacement should be conducted only if a preliminary analysis shows that more than 500 residents would be directly displaced. Because the city only identified 45 projected development sites in the study area, and only 4 were residential sites, the city concluded that only 18 residents would be directly displaced. These examples underscore the problem that current land use methodology or the process used by the city, and ultimately putting in question the credibility of the city and its ability to thoughtfully create a plan that reflects the actual needs and concerns of New Yorkers. What are we asking for? 1, the charter should require a secret technical manual revision process that occurs at a minimum every 5 years. 2, the charter should create a separate space for community concerns to be heard about the actual methodology. For example, they can have a comment period or a public hearing. 3, the changes to the seeker are taken out of the complete discretion of the mayor, and that the process should be overseen by an appointed commission utilizing an expert panel to review and propose updates that the commissioners are appointed equally. In other words, no one has more power over the other. And lastly, on that area is we believe the charter should require a detailed displacement, both direct and indirect analysis anytime an environmental impact study is required. Lastly, currently there is no requirement that the impact found in the environmental review process actually be dealt with. In the Jerome Avenue rezoning, the city projected adverse impacts to commercial tenants like the auto workers along the corridor and also for schools in the district. However, the mitigation the city offered were not comprehensive enough, and we were also left to local elected officials to negotiate with the city. What we're asking for is for every impact study the city puts out there, there should also be a mitigation plan. The charter should require that the final mitigation plan be legally binding, enforceable, and timely. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you very much, Ms. Rivera. With the opening statements finished, I will entertain questions from the members. Sal, you have the first question, followed by Jimmy Vaca, and then Paula Gavin.
Good evening. Just following up on what Ms. Rivera pointed out, I mean, all great cities have to have space for across the economic class, and what we've seen with the zoning proposals is very stiff opposition on the part of many communities around the issue of displacement, where poor folks and working class folks get driven out of those communities as prices skyrocket. The question I have is, how do we achieve that balance, that balance of growth, but at the same time making sure that folks that have lived in communities for long periods of time and are working class and poor have the ability to stay in New York City?
I was just, one of the things is that the analysis and the study has to be done, and it isn't being done. When rezonings come into the community, as they did in Jerome Avenue, the issues arise as the planning phase is coming to a close. And so you have to do an actual analysis. What are the households? Who's in the household? You have to deal with the race issue. You have to deal with the priority of the community. I happen to be a tenant fighting not to be displaced in my community. I am a volunteer with CASA. So I experience this every day. No one has knocked on my door to assess my situation as a person with disability and how I remain in my community along with my neighbors. So priority has to be given, but you have to understand who makes up the community. Why are we being displaced if we've been there 10, 20, 30 years? A better job has to be done in ascertaining that information. A net loss policy has to be developed. So there has to be initial work at the front level before you get to the end level to then make the decision that we should have done a better job.
What does city planning have to say about this?
I'd be glad to kick it off. I'm glad that included in your question was the premise that growth is occurring, because we know that we are at an all-time high in population and we're projected to continue growing, yet we have the exact same land mass. So even without any rezoning, these pressures, these gentrification pressures and fears are real. And doing nothing only makes the situation that much harder. When we look at issues of concerns about displacement, we need to look at it through the lens of what zoning and land use tools can do. They can spur the development of more housing in transit-rich neighborhoods, and in particular, permanently affordable housing. But the city also has available to it a suite of additional tools. In any rezoning, we work with an alphabet soup of other city agencies, but I would say first among them is the Department of Housing Preservation and Development. And they have developed a number of programs, a certificate of no harassment pilot in rezoning areas, providing free legal assistance to tenants who believe that they are under threat, that they are being harassed, a tenant ambassadors program. So I should mention, in addition to the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, we also work in rezonings and neighborhood plans very closely with the Department of Small Business Services, because another part of what defines a neighborhood is the small businesses that meet the retail needs, that meet the needs of a neighborhood. And so it is the combination of the entirety of tools that are available to the city, which go well beyond land use.
How do you...
Wait. Joe, I thought you wanted to...
Just want to say very quickly, a critical part of this is the law of supply and demand and the economic impact of scarcity, and there needs to be a calculation when you do rezonings. There's upzonings and there's downzonings. The previous administration made a lot of reference to all the land that had been rezoned. A substantial amount of that rezoning had a net effect of reducing the number of housing units available for production in places where it could have been produced. And one of the problems with the land use review process is it puts great burdens on anything that allows for increased housing production, but has a lower a review threshold on things that contract. And I think making sure the process pays attention to where you're limiting supply as well as expanding it is critically important part of the land use review process.
Well, yeah, how do you explain that there are 60,000 people in shelters in New York City, and many of them have jobs, they simply can't afford to pay the rent. They simply can't afford housing. So something is at a sink.
I'm glad you raised the issue of housing for the homeless. I would expand it even to supportive housing. Frequently, land use applications that are producing housing for more vulnerable populations are highly, highly controversial. But the 60,000 homeless that you mentioned, that is a constituency that doesn't show up at the hearings. That is where a citywide perspective becomes so important, because understandably, communities are afraid of change and frequently are opposed to a city action to create this type of supportive housing. And that's why we believe that the composition of the commission, the City Planning Commission, is so helpful in bringing a broader citywide perspective that gives voice to those who otherwise might not turn up at public hearings.
Sal, any?
Second round?
Yeah. Jimmy Vaca, then Paula Gavin, and then Jim Karras. I have you, Allison.
I want to thank you all. And Commissioner Rose, I was before the commission when you were chair. I was district manager years ago. So I thank you all for your service. I know you have concerns about where we're going with land use and ULURP and what issues or aspects of it the commission may consider. Several points you brought up, and several points I wanted to bring up. Right now, when the City Planning Commission has a pre-ULURP item, there are interagency meetings that take place with commission staff before the item is certified. Those meetings sometimes take a year to a year and a half, then the item is certified and it goes to the community board. I've requested and continue to do so as a former district manager, that the district manager of the board representing that agency, the board, namely, should be at those meetings. Community boards feel that they are omitted from the process, and they feel that they are engaged only during the ULURP 60-day clock period. I think engaging them sooner would be to your benefit and to the city's benefit, and doing it sooner rather than later makes for a better process. Number one. Number two, I do believe in comprehensive planning, so much so that years ago, when I was district manager, I wanted to do a 197A plan. I wanted to do it until I found out that it took 2 years of work and that the plan is only advisory, and that other boards had done it, and basically it didn't amount to much, not even what was written on paper. So how do we, the question I have, of course, is how do we have meaningful community planning if we now have a 197 process, 197A, and it's only advisory and it has no teeth, and local neighborhoods don't feel engaged? I do know that you mentioned the political process, Commissioner Rose. I think you mentioned the political process, and I know you were alluding to the New York City Council, but I do want to note that the Planning Commission of the City of New York is controlled by the mayor, and some communities feel that that is a political process, that the City Planning Commission members, who are in majority appointed by the mayor, do what the mayor's planning intended from the very beginning. And that it's only in the council that local neighborhoods have an option, because members can modify or defeat items here at the council. EIS and EAS statements basically rubber stamp whatever the intent of the proposal is. So those issues concern me. These are long-standing issues, nothing new. It's not a charge against this administration. It's going on for years. And the last thing, again, Commissioner Rose, I happen to agree with you. The building department enforcement is terrible, but it's been terrible for years. So we do all these downzonings and rezonings, and yet enforcement is lacking. And we keep saying that the buildings department is terrible, yet it continues to be terrible. And local neighborhoods don't have anyone protecting them, they feel. And permits are given in error constantly. And you know, people question this and ask about this. So let me go back to my first point. Where do we stand on having community board district managers as representing those agencies involved from the very beginning? And number two, do any of you have any ideas regarding strengthening 197A planning?
I'd be glad to take that on. I think that there is a lot of misconception about what goes on in the discussions that precede the filing of an application. Applicants come in and they have an idea for a project. Depending upon the sophistication of the applicant, they may have already retained land use counsel and have a project that is even in the realm of the possible. Others are landowners who will come in and say, I'd really like to get a significant upzoning, but I don't want to do MIH, things that are just entirely out of keeping. The process is a technical review, not a negotiation, not a political review, to assure that the application that is given to the public is not one necessarily that the Department of City Planning supports, but rather is one that has the information available, that has the analyses done, so that what is presented to start the ULURP process is complete and accurate description. I will say that the first time an applicant is in contact with us, our uniform advice is to go and to speak to the community board and to speak to the elected officials who represent the community, because we know that that makes for a better process and for a better project for both of them. I do, however, do not think that it is advisable to bring outside of the executive, which is responsible for making sure that the applications are complete and accurate, to do that at that phase. With respect to the 197A plan, if I could turn that over to you, Anita.
So the 197A plans are advisory, as you say. I think that there has been historically a great deal of deviation in how they are addressed and handled at the community board level. And to the extent that they are informed and robust, they are things that actually do give some sort of grounding to what the community board and the city planning commission consider in those areas. They're not universally done in that robust a way, and I think partly that may be, as you said, due to the fact that they are not binding. But on that issue, I think we have a view that they cannot stand instead of the planning that we do. They certainly can give us a sense of what a community is looking for, but that we have to work in New York City, which is a very dynamic environment where people are coming and going, and we have this crisis of growth that we have to deal with right now in the immediate moment. And so that a plan that takes several years to develop can't actually stand instead of the commission's decision-making authority relative to proposals that are before it. So we think they serve as a good guide, but we certainly do not endorse the notion that they should have weight that would stand in the stead of the decision-making process of the City Planning Commission.
If I might address, Commissioner Vaca also raised questions about the City Planning Commission itself and its operations. The commission is comprised of 13 members, 7 appointed by the mayor, 5 appointed by the borough presidents, and 1 by the public advocate. If you were to look at the votes of the commission, they are overwhelmingly unanimous. If you were to look at instances in which there were only 1 abstention or a no vote, that is the vast majority. In my 2 years, there has never been a 7-6 vote. And Anita informs me that throughout this administration, there has not been a 7-6 vote. I can't remember where there was one. This is not because of groupthink. I think it is a testament to the Euler process that by the time something comes to the commission, it has been informed by the community board, by the borough president. It has been informed by, first, a public hearing at which the members of the public, in addition to the representatives of the community board and the borough president, testify. The fact that the commission deliberates in public, and at this point, because of technology, we live stream our deliberations. We're required to produce a report. In the report, we address all of the comments, pro and con, that we have received. I also think that the fact that the commission votes in this way is a testament to the work of the department in preparing applications so that the information that is out there is complete and robust enough to be able to make an informed decision. I know I can speak for the commission that I currently have. It is a very thoughtful, deliberative, but also a collegial body that is looking to do the right thing for the city. I think that the borough commissioners would each tell you they are not the city planning commissioner for their borough. They are city planning commissioners who have to balance equities of individual neighborhoods plus the entire city. Joe?
I appreciate very much your sincerity, and I know the hard work you do and the effort you put in. But from a local neighborhood perspective, I have to say that communities fully expect that when the borough offices, known as the commission, when the borough offices send a ULURP application to the community board, they fully expect the planning commission to vote yes. So that step is almost assured. Once your office completes the paperwork and makes sure that the application is accurate and technically correct, and you give it to the community board community boards fully expect that after they vote yes or no, the commission will vote yes based on it, because it would not have reached that level at the community board if the commission was not going to give it the high sign up front.
Commissioner, if I might address that, we will certify an application if it is complete, if the information is accurate. But I personally have made statements at the time of certification that the department does not support the application. Some applicants, knowing that the director of the department, sitting as the chair of the commission, has that view, may choose not to go forward. Others have chosen to go forward, and they do it at their peril.
Thank you. I think we have Joe and then Vishan next.
I just want to say, first of all, I think I remember a few 7-6 votes, and I think dissent among the commission and a collegial discussion, but debate is a healthy thing. I think diversity of opinion, and there should be votes that are not unanimous. There are plenty that are, as there are in the community board as well. But so a certain amount of balance between consensus and agreement, but also healthy disagreement is a worthwhile thing. Just to the 197A plan, I want to address that. First of all, good planning takes a lot of hard work. So yeah, 2 years for a 197A plan that's meaningful strikes me as a realistic time frame, and sometimes perhaps even ambitious. Under the charter as it exists, the 197A plans have a status. Every action taken pursuant to an approved 197A plan requires comment and attention by the city agencies acting within it. Now, if the 197A plan calls for things that don't have budget allocations or don't implement themselves, yes, they are advisory, and there are competing and conflicting give and takes that happen on the council and at the commission and within every city agency. But one of the reasons for that, I don't want to say it's a trial by fire, but it's certainly not easy, and it's not easy for the department when it does its own plans, is that once a plan is adopted, whether it's a 197A or a plan by the Department of City Planning, it has to be paid attention to, and there are legal hurdles to ignoring it or disregarding it that are serious. So it doesn't implement itself, but they are taken seriously by the department and by the commission.
Okay, Vishan will be the last, and then Paula.
I just want to quickly say, Commissioner, so on the first issue, I just wanted to corroborate. Our office has 4 major projects going through ULURP right now. In every instance, the department has asked us to have discussions with the local community board. We have done that. It has been a more fruitful process. So in no instance do I know of that the community board hasn't seen the application until certification rolls around. That may happen, but it's certainly not happened in my experience. I just want to say on the 197A plan, and to just back up what Joe was saying, I do think they are taken very seriously. But imagine the converse. Imagine if every 197A plan was binding, and every community in the city said they wanted little to no new housing in their community. We would then have a situation where instead of 60,000 people in homeless shelters, we could have 120,000 people in homeless shelters. And I think that is the fundamental problem, and it's the balance that we're all trying to strike.
You are right. I think what I'm looking for is something in the middle. Not just that it's advisory. I know it cannot be binding. But I do think there has to be something. I don't know what it is, but there has to be something that tells communities, if you put in all this work, we're listening to you. Right now, there's not that feeling. And I certainly don't want boards to say no to everything, because then they're not looking at a citywide need. So I understand your point.
Paula?
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I want to do a follow-up question on governance, since that is the basis of the charter, and specifically thinking about the principles of growth and equity. What is the real difference between the commission and the city planning department, and how does that really structure and help the governance and the accomplishment of goals?
Thank you for the question, because while they are very closely linked, there are distinct roles. The Department of City Planning is an expert agency staffed by planners of unparalleled expertise. They provide the rigorous evaluation that informs land use initiatives. I've worked around the world, and I've headed the planning department for another major city, and I can tell you that New York City's planning department is unlike any other municipal agency in the breadth of its expertise and professionalism. I think probably one example that stands out is our population division. Our population division gives us information about who our population are, what their needs are, what languages they speak, what ages they are. That information informs our planning. Our chief demographer was the key witness in our state attorney general's lawsuit against the U.S. Census Bureau, challenging the addition or the proposed addition of a citizenship question. I also know the quality of the staff from working with them, but also by the fact that Department of City Planning staff have been rated to head the planning departments of Los Angeles, Pittsburgh, Seattle, among other cities. We submitted, in addition to Anita's and my testimony, some additional materials. These are fact sheets, information briefs that the staff routinely produces on topical issues of the day. They are not political documents. They are policy analytical documents. And so I firmly believe that the Planning Commission could not do the high-quality work that it does without being informed by the analytical work of the department. I'll also note, though, that under this administration and taking advantage of technology, we have made incredible strides in increasing transparency and taking information that was available on PDFs in a whole host of other city agencies and mapping it, making it available for free. Our zoning resolution is now available for free. It used to require printing 1,500 pages and paying $750. It is now online and searchable. And so it is the mission of the department to continue both doing high-quality analysis, but also making it available to the public so that every land use decision, every community board interaction is more informed.
Could I just add to that, you know, the department in its relationship to the commission is responsible for providing the underpinnings of the land use rationales for the decision that the commission ultimately makes. And in that regard, they actually do a first-class job of developing proposals such as mandatory inclusionary housing, things like what is the right parking that we should require, grounded in true analysis and facts. And you could not have the commission make responsible decisions about these very important and significant and impactful issues without that kind of analysis. And that's the kind of professional staff that the department is, and that's the value that they provide to this process.
Just to take a slight elaboration, the Planning Commission is ideally apolitical but expert legislative body on land use matters, and the Planning Department is a mayoral agency, an executive agency that among its functions, in addition to doing the demographics and all sorts of planning with other agencies, staffs and supports the Planning Commission as well. And it is embodied, they come together, the two entities come together in the chair of the Planning Commission, who's also the director of the Department of City Planning, which is an unusual construct in most governing entities, but I think it's a very important one. It allows some real teeth and oomph into the both ways. And the one point I wanted to make, and I will be submitting a more elaborate written testimony, I won't bore you with it here, but planning by its very nature is the most entrepreneurial of governmental activities. Most city agencies, most activities are caught up in the day-to-day crisis, the political exigencies, budget constraints and the like. To actually plan, as you know, the metaphor, the analogy is you have to paddle faster than the current in order to be able to steer, requires mobilizing other city agencies outside of just the professional staff at city planning or the views of the Planning Commission, and that's why it's important to have the interaction between the mayor and the chair of the Planning Commission / director of the department be a really healthy and one that's not, I think, tampered with too much, because it's a hard enough job as it is.
Thank you. Jim, Paula, do you have more? No, I didn't. Jim?
Thank you all very much. I agree that, this is an area we have to be really careful and deliberate in, looking at exploring changes. So I want to focus on just sort of one bucket of projects or land use applications, and that's when we have large city-sponsored rezonings or significant impactful land use actions, either by city planning or EDC, that can have a significant impact on a neighborhood. And in those, there clearly is a pre-ULURP process, and I think I go along with what Jimmy Vaca said. It's just that not everyone feels included in that pre-ULURP process. So why not look at surgical changes we can make when they're, and in my experience, maybe sometimes more when EDC is the lead than when city planning is the lead, that certain communities feel like they have been left out of the process. Why not look at those for the ability to have something during the pre-certification process where it can be opened up a bit to stakeholders, elected officials, and the types of things that Chair Lago was talking about. Other agencies can be brought in, other programs can be brought in, determinations can be made that if SBS doesn't have the ability to deal with something, maybe this piece of the proposal should be changed or taken out. I think it's worked in our workings with the city when we have engaged in such a process, and I'm hoping that we could look at that and try to come up with some modest proposals around that. And I'd like to hear what you all have to say.
So I would just say, Jim, that it strikes me that what you're talking about is actually, in fact, what has happened on every single large land use city-sponsored rezoning that has occurred, at least since I've been at city planning, even ones that EDC was responsible for. They all have had tremendous public outreach, stakeholder engagement, long before those projects were actually certified, helping to shape what the role of the various agencies would be and what, in fact, the proposal would be. So I'm a little bit confused because I'm not aware of a single instance, and maybe you could share one with us, where that has not been the case. While those have not all been in the form of a sort of formal engagement in the way that we did for the Greater East Midtown rezoning, they have still nonetheless been those kinds of engagements.
I would say two things to that. Most of our experiences with you guys in the last 5 years have been good. That doesn't mean that it will stay that way under a different administration. And also, I'll give the example of the Garment Center, where we felt like we had to drag the administration kicking and screaming to the table on that. The text amendment was about to be dropped when we insisted on a stakeholder group. We had been told that significant outreach had been done to every constituency group imaginable, but when we talked to people, we got different answers from them. And I think, for better or worse, I think that if we hadn't stepped in, that there would have been such an outcry, which we saw at the first community board meeting, that it probably would never have happened. So why not formalize that in some way?
I would just echo what Anita said, that it is the city-sponsored initiatives, and in particular, major neighborhood changes, be it a garment center or a neighborhood rezoning, that are preceded by years of interaction. But one size doesn't fit all. Some communities prefer to have a very informal process, in other instances, a steering group. And I do think it's important, given the diversity of our city and its neighborhoods, not to have a one-size-fits-all approach to how a pre-certification process works on city-sponsored initiatives. The other thing I'd note is that, again, technology is very much changing our ability to reach out to a broader array of stakeholders. As proud as we are of ULURP and its very formalized series of public hearings, we know that there are interested folks in the community who may not be able to get out to a community board hearing, and we are increasingly using online tools to solicit feedback. We're in the midst of working with Councilmember Lander on the Gowanus rezoning, and are receiving input from community voices who are not showing up at our community public events. And I do think that that makes the planning all the richer.
Allison?
Thank you, Chairperson. So I have a couple of sort of unrelated questions, I suppose. So you mentioned the exec portal with where the applications are available. Are those applications available only post-certification, or are they available during the pre-application process so that individuals know what projects are in conversation?
If an application has actually been filed, it would be available. So yes. So
the pre-application process,
if it's filed.
If it's filed, okay, before certification,
Yes.
that's very helpful.
But there is no requirement that it be filed any period of time, and sometimes, particularly on major developments, a developer will go into the pre-certification period to talk with both the department and other interested individuals and won't file an actual application until much later in the process.
Right. I was wondering, hoping that any of the city planning, either current or past city planning staff and leadership would answer the questions that Ms. Vega Rivera asked about the secret process. I think that the issues of displacement in development and the lack of sort of a deep socioeconomic analysis in the secret is something that I've consistently heard and seen, and I'm interested in your feedback on that.
So I would like to tackle that first, and certainly others can jump in. First of all, I think it's always good to remind everyone what SEEKR is and what it isn't. SEEKR is a document that discloses potential impacts in order for decision makers to be informed when they're making their discretionary determinations. I think that over time, it has come to be considered as something much more than that, in terms of being considered something that will lay out a sort of pathway to cure a number of ails. We certainly very, very seriously take the risk of displacement as something to be considered when we are doing our rezonings, but the imprecision of what is causing displacement in a particular situation where we have neighborhoods that are already in flux, it's very hard for us to know that a rezoning action is actually exacerbating displacement or not. That leads us to say that we have to be careful about how we look at this. In terms of the factors that are considered, everyone should understand that the SEEKR manual is simply the city's technical guidance in terms of implementing state law, which is the state Environmental Quality Review Act, and that's the state law that we're actually implementing when we do our SEEKR analysis. And so we have to hew to what analyses that says should be done, and what we do in the technical manual, because we have so many city agencies and our reviews are complex, is try to define in a robust way what's an appropriate methodology in order to meet the requirements of that state statute. So we actually are not in a position to make modifications to that underlying act. That would have to be done in state law. And as to displacement methodology and socioeconomic factors, we understand that over time there may be needs to take some look again at how we are doing that analysis. We have to be able to find reliable data that we can use in that regard. And in regards to housing data, we have some constraints in terms of the availability of data from the state that we can use in making those analyses. So the suggestion that we possibly look at what any individual actors in that arena are doing is probably not something that can be done through the secret technical analysis. But as Marisa mentioned, the city has developed many robust tools to address those issues, both in neighborhoods that we're rezoning and in neighborhoods that we're not rezoning in terms of anti-displacement efforts. But the city will look at what is the appropriate role that we should actually be playing in terms of changing the seeker methodology, but because it's really a highly technical role, we would suggest that to have that be something that is weighed in on or considered with the public at large would not be appropriate, because it's actually really a technical analysis that we're doing. The other point that I would respond to in terms of the suggestions that were made with respect to every 5 years looking at a review of this is to say that over time, from the time seeker started to today, every time that there's been a technical manual revision, it has added hundreds of pages to significant environmental impact statements that I would suggest that people need to think about whether or not the information that is being developed is actually useful to decision makers. It's defensive in a large measure because it's really now more a litigation document than what it was really intended to be. And there may be other approaches that we need to look at to address this issue, which we absolutely know is undeniable, but I'm not sure that doing it through the secret technical manual is the right tool.
I can just follow up on the issue. So seeker is a disclosure and a discussion document, as Anita said, pursuant to very technical requirements, and those technical requirements have to comply, but they can certainly be reviewed. I want to go to the point, it was in the materials submitted in terms of what you're looking at in terms of ULURP and in terms of the mitigation measures that are when an impact or a potential impact is identified and is therefore called out for mitigation in the context of an approval by under the ULURP process, whether it's displacement or some other different kind of identified environmental impact. The follow-up on those, of the implementation of those mitigation measures is something that I think does require attention and certainly reporting on by the involved agencies and the lead agencies to the decision makers in terms of at some point what was done, what was the impact, and what were the steps taken to mitigate it. Because that's and I'm sure I'm going to get abuse from some people for having said this, but that is that's a question. It's all fine at the point at which the decision is made, but what then is the, in fact, accountability for following up, and what's the record that needs to be done? That's something that does warrant some attention and discussion.
Thank you.
I would also.
Thank you. Andy, I had a question for you. Since you were part of the 1989 charter revision, one, would you agree that how land is used in any particular place is always a political act and has political implications no matter who is making the decision?
I'm not sure I would agree with that, actually.
Okay.
I think there's a lot of sort of what I would call professional planning, analytical expertise that gets brought to bear on those decisions, and that maybe science isn't the right word for it, but when you look at a city like New York and you look at the housing situation, that it does lend itself to looking at numbers and doing an analysis and based on that coming to some conclusions about what on a citywide basis would be a good policy and a good action to take in any given context. And now it is political in the sense that elected officials, if it's going through the land use process, are going to vote on it and make a decision.
I don't mean political with a capital P.
Yeah.
I mean that to the effect that decision-making affects people. One can make this decision or that decision or another decision. The choice of decisions is in and of itself political, whether it's where you spend whether you go to Dunkin' Donuts or whether you make your own donuts or whether you allow superstores or not. That's a political decision, not with a capital P, but it's not just ones and zeros either.
Yeah, fair enough, fair enough.
Madam Chair, I might note that the considerations that you have laid out point to the fact that land use decisions are frequently controversial and that decisions can have allocational ramifications, but I'm not sure that that equates to political.
Do you think the effects are political? Just that people and communities feel them as political?
I would stick with the fact that I believe that they are controversial because rarely do communities speak with one voice. There are multiple stakeholders, and so I would hearken back to what Andy indicated, that at the department, we look at...
I didn't say the department. I didn't ask about the department or the commission or any particular or any actors indeed in the land use process. I was not asking a question about the land use process, but just the very nature of the issue. I think you were next, Carl.
Well, this is, maybe this is a clarification of what you were saying, Madam Chair, but...
Be careful about mansplaining, Carl.
I'm sorry?
I said be careful about the possibility of mansplaining.
I'm building on what you said, Madam Chair. And this is, I guess, to a theme that all of you in one way or another noted, which is that we live in an extremely dynamic, complicated city, and perhaps in many ways the most complicated city on earth. And people's lives are being affected in lots of different ways all the time without the intervention of government. It's just the nature of the marketplace that's happening. And I just really wanted to at least clarify or understand something that Anita said with respect to the seeker process, which is that, just to make it clear that what seeker is looking at is not whether displacement is taking place in a neighborhood or what's happening in a neighborhood specifically, but whether the action that's before the Planning Commission or ultimately the City Council and the Community Board, what the effect of that particular action will be and whether it will, in fact, accelerate, in case of displacement, accelerate displacement, reduce displacement, accelerate other impacts on the environment, as opposed to whether those impacts are existing already, which in many neighborhoods, for all the reasons that all of you have indicated, is happening in this dynamic city. Is that?
That is exactly right. You know, when we look at displacement, what we look at is sort of what is the amount of regulated housing stock that there is in the particular area, and whether or not there are a number of units that are at jeopardy of being eliminated or displaced as a consequence of new development that will occur through our actions. And so we have a limited amount of data that we can use to make those determinations. One of the large issues in that regard has to do with preferential rent, because that's with respect to units where individuals are not paying market rent in certain neighborhoods. It's below the rent regulated rents that the state allows to be charged. And so those units don't really get captured in this analysis, but those are still people that are vulnerable. But we don't have any actual way of taking that into account, because it's very hard for us to understand or know all of the data. But my main point there was simply that there is a distinction between what our action is causing and that those things that are occurring naturally, they're not really natural things, but that are occurring without our action. And I think in the public discussion, those two things get very blended, and it's really hard for, I understand, the public to really parse out the fact that displacement is occurring in many neighborhoods in this city where we're not taking any action. And we actually do believe that when we do take action, we can have a positive effect on those situations, because of the fact that part of what we're doing is ensuring that there are permanently affordable housing units created in those neighborhoods.
And I'm sorry, Carl, I did not mean to suggest that you would in any way attempt to explain me better than I did myself.
Especially with you, Madam Chair, I would be extremely careful.
Sal?
I have two questions. I noticed on the Board of Standards and Appeals that there has to be, as part of the membership, an experienced architect, a planner, an engineer. What is your view, any of you, that a certain percentage of people that sit on the City Planning Commission should be urban planners?
How much time have you spent with trained urban planners? I think the...
You make it sound like trained seals,
I think it's critically important.
Howard?
I think it's critically important that the department be staffed by a professional, trained staff. I think if you look at the history of the Planning Commission over the 8 decades and the diversity and the judgment, it's important. And there is now, and has been for quite some time, the confirmation requirement in terms of qualifications by the council for people nominated. But some of the most valuable, I would say, in my experience and observation, the most insightful, experienced, valuable members of the commission have not been trained planners, and they have been people from all sorts of different professional qualifications and experience. Doesn't mean that there shouldn't be planners involved, but the kinds of judgments and decisions that are involved really are, to go to the chair's point, somewhat political, some governmental. They're not just professional planning decisions.
No, but we have 13 members, right? Sure. So why, as I said, the Board of Standards and Appeals has three of the appointees have to be experienced professionals. So out of the 13 members, why can't 5 or 4 be urban planners? We have a lot of brain power in this city, a lot of people from academia that really have a great vision for planning. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't have people who don't have that experience. I'm saying a mix would be helpful if we codified that in the charter.
If I could take that on, I think the beauty of the commission is the diversity of its members and the fact that people who don't have planning degrees bring incredible experience. I think many here will have known our very, very long-serving Commissioner Irwin Cantor. Exactly, who sadly passed away. He was the representative of the Queensborough president.
Who's that?
Irwin Cantor. He was one of our nation's most storied structural engineers. We have people who have expertise in the brokerage community. We have on the Commission of Retail Specialists, people who undertake economic development, who may not have AICPA behind their name, who may not have taken a planning degree, but who bring the wealth of experience. I also think the structure of the commission, having multiple different appointing authorities, is yet another guarantee of having a diversity of viewpoints. And I'll end just by noting that planning is so broad. That's part of the delight of working in the planning profession. It encompasses housing, it encompasses industrial jobs, it encompasses open space, transportation. And so having the ability of 6, 7 different appointing authorities to appoint people who they think will best take on this citywide mantle, I would say is the way to go.
So you would be opposed to having a fixed number of urban planners on the commission?
I would think it inadvisable.
It's inadvisable. Okay. We respectfully disagree. But,
one quick and then one.
I just want to quickly respond on that. Where I agree with my fellow panelists that a mix is very important. I think the commission did receive written testimony from the American Institute of Architects that spoke somewhat to this issue. The City of Los Angeles has appointed now a chief design officer. I think, this isn't just about architecture, but I do think a lot of people are concerned a lot of new development is atrociously ugly. And so, I think that should be an advisory role. I'm not sure it has to be a legally binding thing, but I do think there are concerns in the city about the quality of new construction.
Okay, good. Thank you for that. I've been, I was in government for a number of years, and I've seen some appointees to the commission that that were clueless, in my opinion, about urban planning. But that's another issue. One final question: New York City Housing Authority properties undergoing a lot of development, a lot of proposals out there. Should they be subject to ULURP?
I don't believe so. Our NYCHA properties operate under an extensive web of federal regulation, and that is what determines how they get developed. I think it not appropriate to bring them within ULURP.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the last question here, and Andy, it's you again. Although I would add, my counsel just found the dictionary definition of political, meaning of, for, or related to citizens, civil, civic, belonging to the state. But that's not my question. My last question for you, Andy, as a member of the 1989 Charter Vision Commission staff, is in looking at what you intended in 1989 and how land use processes are operating now, is it what you thought it would be? Is it what you hoped it would be?
Yes, I guess it is what I thought it would be and what, to some extent, what we hoped it would be. I guess the key issue is the way the city council functions. So, and I think that's evolved over time for a number of reasons. But one of the concerns when the charter revision was enacted was how would a legislative body act? How much deference would be given to individual council members over their districts? And how much...
You're going to have to speak more into the mic. I'm told you're not getting picked up.
Yeah, turn it on.
The button has to be red.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. The question is, how would the legislative body, the city council, operate? How much deference to the local council member on items in their districts, and how much of an ability of the rest of the council, the leadership in particular, to modulate, control, or affect that. And one thing that I found very interesting was certainly in about the first 10, 15 years of the council's involvement, I was very impressed with the strength of the leadership and the balance that was struck there. Then in the course of that time period, term limits were brought in, and that really changed the whole dynamic of the council, and it's evolved over time. And I've been watching, and I'm a little less close now to what's going on at the council than I was, but I have a sense that there's just a different approach now and a little more deference to the individual council member. And I think in a certain way, that's kind of inevitable in a legislative body. I don't know exactly what can be done about it, but to me that is perhaps the most important issue in how it works, how that balance is struck, what role the leaders of the council play in that dynamic. And so that's the area that I've watched with greatest interest and concern, but I think the results have been reasonably good on that front.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank the whole panel, seeing no further questions. And I would like to thank you all for coming here, sharing your expertise and your thoughts, but also ask that if you have additional thoughts or you want to educate us about anything, that you do so. We would love to receive written comments, or if you'd like to call us, or in any other way that you want to communicate, we would like to hear from you. And particularly as this process moves along, we'd love to be able to call upon you again. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for sharing, and we appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
I'm just going to move over so you can go down. Maybe they won't bother me. Yeah.
Microphone should be on, but I'm just not talking red.
grab a seat. We're going to start our second panel. Our second panel will be discussing comprehensive planning, for which we will be joined by Howard Slatkin from City Planning with the assistance of his director, Anita Lermont, Vicki Bean from CHPC.
Sorry.
No, I'm sorry, Vicki. I'm sorry, Vicki. Patrice Carroll is joining us via Skype, and Sandy Hornick. Please go ahead and introduce yourselves, since I have mangled the whole thing, and share any initial comments you may have. Each of you, once again, will have approximately 3 minutes, and then we will engage in a question and answer, question and reflection period of hopefully robust conversation. Vicki, do you want to start? You have to turn it, it has to be red.
I'm sorry. My name is Vicki Bean, and I'm the Boxer Family Professor of Law at NYU Law School, and I'm a faculty director of the Furman Center for Real Estate and Urban Policy. So that's my identification. I also had the pleasure of serving as the city's Commissioner of Housing Preservation and Development for 2014 through 2017. So I very much appreciate all of the incredibly hard work and good thinking that the Commission is putting into this process. I know better than many, since I'm serving on the city's commission to reform the city's property tax system, just how much work is involved. So thank you very much for all you're doing, and thank you for having me. So I want to make a couple of points, and I've submitted much more detailed testimony in writing, but I want to make a couple of points. First, I'm not sure that we're all on the same page about what is meant by comprehensive planning. And I think that a charter mandate for a comprehensive plan is just really empty platitudes without much more detail about what is meant by comprehensive planning, how exactly it differs from what we do now, what effect the process and any plan developed will have on how land use, housing, infrastructure, and other decisions are made. Without much more definition, voters asked to approve a charter amendment requiring a comprehensive plan simply can't know what they are voting for, what its costs and benefits are, and how it is likely to affect the issues that they care about. A survey of everyone in this room would reveal an enormous range of views about what a mandate for comprehensive planning even means. To some, it means that each neighborhood will be required to allow enough affordable housing, for example, to meet some minimum that the city as a whole determines. To others, it means self-determination, by which each neighborhood would get to determine how much affordable housing should be allowed in that neighborhood. To others, it means that each neighborhood will get to determine the preconditions that must be met before any additional housing capacity is authorized. To others, it's an opportunity to widen the scope of who has input into the process and to decrease the power of the homeowners, preservationists, and other interest groups that now dominate community board processes. We're likely to have at least 20 more versions of what it means as well if we just ask people in this room. That's dangerous. Indeed, it's irresponsible to submit such an ambiguous concept to a vote. It just means that we've avoided the tough political choices that are by using weasel words, words that sound specific and indisputable, but that are, in fact, evading the hard political and policy questions that the issue raises. Until we have a much more specific proposal, voters will have no idea what they're voting for, except that comprehensiveness and planning sound reasonable like apple pie. If I can just make one last point, charter revision should do no harm, and a mandated comprehensive plan could bring benefits to the city. It could also do considerable harm by making it all the more difficult for the city to achieve equitable growth needed to ensure housing affordability and thriving neighborhoods. There's a growing consensus across land use and urban policy experts, and I've detailed all that in my testimony, that land use regulation, including planning and planning consistency requirements, is limiting growth in productive cities like New York in ways that have very negative consequences for equity and inclusion. A mandate for a comprehensive plan could make an already lengthy, unpredictable, and costly land use process even more onerous. And that's coupled with the fact that there's relatively little evidence about the effect that comprehensive planning has on housing affordability. Again, I've detailed that evidence in my written comments, but the evidence suggests that comprehensive planning at best is not very helpful in achieving housing affordability. It bears noting, for example, that many of the nation's most unaffordable cities, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, Miami, Washington, D.C., all have comprehensive plans. In some, there's just too much at stake to adopt an ambiguous mandate for a costly and time-consuming process that has failed to help cities far less complicated than New York to build fairer, more affordable, and more livable cities. We should have a constructive debate about how to achieve more equitable development in the city, but the proposed mandate attempts to short-circuit that debate by promising a panacea that is ill-defined and contrary to the evidence. Thank you.
Thank you. Sandy?
Good evening. My name is Sandy Hornick. I'm an urban planner in private practice, but I spent 38 years at the Department of City Planning in various capacities. During my years there were a series of charter mandates that sought to create a more rational and equitable planning process. The list of possible revisions in your report reminds me how hard it is to achieve these goals. Periodically, the charter is revised because people feel the process is not open enough, and after a few years, we find ourselves back looking to open up the process again. I think there is a larger issue involved, which is the tension between local desires and citywide needs. New York is already a very crowded place, and after half a century, with a population barely penetrated the 1950 level, it is getting more crowded all the time, adding in just 16 years 6 times the population gain and 1 million more jobs than in the previous 50 years. This has driven up the cost of housing, made subways that were already crowded more crowded, etc. While it is important to have open participation in the decision-making process, it is at least equally important, if not more so, to have a voice at the table for the future, the people who will be competing for housing, employment, recreation, transportation, and so on 5, 10, or 20 years from now. I do not think it is accidental that the 1976 Charter revision, which created ULURP to involve communities in planning, also removed the then unfulfilled 40-year-old charter mandate for a comprehensive plan. Comprehensive planning is inherently a planning exercise with a top-down emphasis, beginning with regional needs, then municipal, then attempting to fit these in a local context. Past charter revisions sought to resolve these conflicts by requiring the issuance of a series of reports and policy statements and by creating a fair share process. But except for the officials who issue a particular document, the public and other elected officials have largely ignored these. Over the years, I've come to think that a more valuable and more achievable approach in a dense, built-up city is for the city to identify issues of strategic importance to provide a context for planning decisions. A comprehensive plan that takes years to assemble by one administration, assuming there is consensus, is not necessarily going to be accepted as a guide by the next one. It may be better to have, for example, a healthy discussion on the city's housing needs, which we've heard much about today, than a plan for where all the housing is going to go. I would implore the Commission to preserve one mechanism for ensuring a transparent process. Scope is a mechanism for ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to comment during the process by limiting review to those changes that have been advertised for public hearing. Determining scope is a determination of fact. It is not a political gesture. Zoning rules that are proposed to be changed are complicated and require technical expertise that reside at city planning. Finally, I note that there is a good chance that among the members of the current council sit one or more future executives of this great city. I would encourage you, in any charter revisions that you propose, to keep in mind that whomever may rise to run this future city have the appropriate authority to do this effectively.
Thank you, Sandy. Howard? And Anita.
I will plansplain for just a moment. I apologize. Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Howard Slatkin. I'm the Deputy Executive Director for Strategic Planning at the Department of City Planning. The history of land use planning in the city charter traces an arc from traditional static notions of comprehensive planning to a practice of strategic planning that supports timely responses to a rapidly changing environment. The most recent attempt, as some have noted, to create a citywide comprehensive plan was the 1969 Plan for New York City. It was undertaken in part to enable the city to qualify for federal public housing funds, but outdated by the time it was complete, widely criticized, and ultimately never adopted. It was following the failure of the 1969 plan that the 1975 Charter Revision Commission, as Sandy noted, eliminated the requirement in the charter for a master plan and in its place established ULURP and community boards to decentralize the land use decision-making process. These changes reflected the planning profession's broader shift away from comprehensive plans and other master planning tools such as urban renewal during that period. In 1989, Charter Revisions established a strategic planning function to help prevent the land use decision process from becoming overly politicized and driven by short-term considerations. Instead of a master plan, the aim was to supply facts, analysis, and consistent objectives to help anchor decisions in clear planning rationales. The city has used this strategic planning model in a range of ways in recent years. Through One NYC, the city has articulated principles and priorities for sustainable and equitable growth, including citywide goals for housing production. City planning regularly undertakes initiatives to advance citywide strategies that address planning issues of pressing significance. Recent examples, of course, include mandatory inclusionary housing, zoning for quality and affordability, and zoning for flood resiliency. By using the internet and a wide variety of interactive tools, which the 1989 Charter Commissioners certainly could not have imagined, the department today makes far more data and analysis available both to decision makers and to the public than it has ever before. There is sometimes a view expressed that if we already had a citywide master plan, that the individual decisions that can be so challenging and contentious would become easier or perhaps even unnecessary. But it's important to recognize that there is no comprehensive plan that could be adopted that would obviate the need for informed and sensitive decision-making based on detailed consideration of specific facts and local conditions. In implementing the objectives of One NYC or of any plan of such scale, goals and objectives often have inherent tensions and must be balanced. Take, for instance, the question of whether a plot of city-owned land within a neighborhood should be used for open space or for affordable housing. There is no citywide plan that can predetermine an appropriate and equitable local outcome for that kind of situation. This is, of course, the job of ULURP, which allows officials to balance competing equities based on sound information and consideration of all views and voices. I'll just have one more thought if I can wrap
Keep
up.
going.
A nimble and practical approach to citywide strategic planning can support timely and equitable decision-making, but approaches that would require every land use decision to be made twice or divert substantial resources away from action would detract from our ability to undertake responsive planning for New York City's dynamic environment and pressing needs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we have Patrice, hold on 1 minute, Patrice Carroll, who is with the Seattle Office of Planning and Community Development. Patrice?
Good evening. Greetings from Seattle. So I was asked to share a little bit about the planning framework that we use here in the city of Seattle. It really starts with the state. We do have a statutory and a mandatory comprehensive plan, and that comes from our State Growth Management Act, which was adopted in the early 1990s. This requires that there are 13 statewide goals, very high level, really born of a time when there was a lot of sprawl in Washington state, and this was the state's attempt to have a more rational future land development system. So there are substantive requirements within the Growth Management Act for local planning. There's also procedures set out for the adoption of plans, how to amend plans, how often plans have to be updated. There are also rules that are established and monitored by the Department of Commerce, so all of the plans are certified at the state level. And then these comprehensive plans really, they set the requirements for our the zoning that each place would adopt. It also provides for an appeal process. There's something called the Growth Management Hearings Board. So if plans are adopted and they can be challenged, and the Growth Management Hearing Board establishes the case law that guides those decisions. So in addition to the state growth management plan, we have regional metropolitan planning organizations. In our region, there's one, it's the Puget Sound Regional Council, and it too has a comprehensive plan. They're just updating theirs now for 2050. And then because Seattle is within King County, we also have the King County Growth Management Council. And they are the ones that take the estimates from the state that are promulgated for growth management planning. And then that council kind of figures out what's the best distribution or what sort of estimated growth we should look at in our individual plans throughout the region. And then we come to the Seattle Comprehensive Plan, which just really applies to our city. We adopted our first comprehensive plan in 1994 under the Growth Management Act. We updated it in 2004, about 10 years later. And then we just had our most recent update was in 2015. According to state law, we're supposed to update these plans every 8 years, but there's often extenuating circumstances like the Great Recession, when we didn't really have the resources to do comprehensive planning, and so sometimes those timelines have been elongated. We're now already beginning to think about our next update, which is going to be due in 2023. Our comprehensive plan, our current comprehensive plan called Seattle 2035, is our vision for how our city will grow and change over the next 20 years. We are planning for a growth of 70,000 housing units and 115,000 more jobs. We have something here in Seattle called the Urban Village Strategy, and that is a strategy that was introduced in our first comprehensive plan under growth management, and it's one that we still use. And it's identifying the areas within our city where we'd like to see growth that's close to transit, that's close to retail, where we can have higher density development. So there are kind of these mini growth centers scattered about. There's 30 of them that are designated within our city. The areas that we really focus on that have been the focus of growth and change over time, and where as we've built out our transit system, we're still building out a light rail system here in Seattle. These are the places that are a priority for those transit services, for high capacity transit and other kinds of public investments. We also have a set of policies that within our plan that promote industrial uses and serve to guide our policies around industrial land. We also have a chapter that deals with our shorelines that, again, is very closely tied to some state law, and there's policies that specifically apply to our shorelines. Well, this planning process is led by our planning department. It does require the participation of many, many departments throughout city government. So this is one way that we can kind of do that collaborative, coordinated planning work together. So this is a time, at least around our major updates every 8 years, that we do kind of bring together a brain trust from across the city to look at things more holistically. Our updates are generally drafted by city staff, although we sometimes use outside consultants to do some of the technical work or special topics. In our last update, equity and displacement was a big issue, and so we did bring in some folks from outside to help us think about that. It's a several-year process. Our last plan was about a 4-year process, and that included extensive community engagement and also an environmental process. So we had an EIS process that kind of paralleled when we were looking at alternatives for growth for the future. We have a set of, within the state framework, there are certain elements that are required. Land use, shoreline management, housing, economic development. We have a container report here. capital facilities, transportation, utilities, and the sort of the typical topics that one addresses in a plan. But we can add other topics, and the city of Seattle has chosen to have a broader comprehensive plan that also addresses environment, parks and open space, community well-being, arts and culture. And we've also included some specific policies for those 30 urban villages that are designated. So there's an abbreviated set of policies for each of those areas.
Okay. Do you
gives
think
the
you could
neighborhoods
begin
an
to sum up?
opportunity to sort of leave their imprint in the comprehensive plan, if you will. Our amendment process, they said we do major updates every 8 years, but we can go in and amend it once a year. So that is a process that allows us to make some minor changes in between. So
Carroll,
I think I'll leave it there and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. The first person I have is Carl, and then Sal.
Thank you, Ms. Carroll. I have, I think, two questions for you. One, the system you described is certainly starting with a state comprehensive plan is a very top-down system, and I don't know if you heard the testimony of Sandy Hornick here, who said, among other things, that a comprehensive plan is almost by definition a top-down rather than a bottom-up plan. And I do note that at least a few years ago, Seattle just basically eliminated its neighborhood councils that were the more or less equivalent of our community boards. So I guess my question to you is, first question is whether this is a top-down approach, and I know there's been a lot of criticism about it from some neighborhoods in Seattle.
I feel that the goals that the state sets are so high level that each individual city does, and even counties, the plans do look very different from different places. So I think there is flexibility within that broader framework, and we certainly do have a lot of bottom-up planning here in Seattle as well. We have the 30 neighborhood plans that, again, are part of our comprehensive plan. They don't get updated every 8 years, so that's a bit of a struggle for us. But I think that there is enough room that we can, and I think it's an opportunity for us as a city to kind of take a broader view. So oftentimes neighborhood plans can be very focused on things that are happening in a particular neighborhood. And I think it's also important for us to come together as a city and think about the city as a whole. So I would say I haven't felt it as too top down. There are some things that they are thinking of changing. There are some topics that are very important now that when the Growth Management Act was written back in 1994 were not as important. And so so there is some work being done at the state level now to sort of refresh the Growth Management Act a little bit and bring in some more of the more relevant topics around climate change and displacement and equity into that framework. We also have the opportunity to do work beyond what the Growth Management Act requires. As I said, we did add a lot of optional elements in Seattle, and those are things that are important to our citizens in our city. We also, through our EIS process is probably very similar to yours, a pretty standard process to look at impacts, but again, perhaps doesn't consider things like the risk of displacement. And so we also, in our last comprehensive plan, we did a separate analysis to look at that and have a better understanding of that when we thought about where growth, where we wanted to guide growth within the city over the next 20 years. So I think there is flexibility within the growth management framework to to kind of make those adjustments and changes.
Thank you. And I have, on your last point, a question as well that is both to you and to the panel. I was here just listening to the panel talking about comprehensive planning and thinking about our last panel and the challenges of environmental review, just thinking about the, from at least given New York's rather expansive environmental review process, and the thought of a citywide environmental review is sort of mind-boggling for me. And my understanding is, and I don't even know how long it would take or how much it would cost, but it would be, given how just in limited areas environmental review is pretty time-consuming and expensive, I assume it would be, that alone would be quite significant. But my understanding is in Seattle, the environmental review for the comprehensive plan is a very light one, and then as you look at actions within that comprehensive plan, a more elaborate environmental review. Is that basically the way it's done?
Again, it depends on the degree of change. In our 2004 update, we did an internal assessment and decided not to do a full environmental impact statement. So that was a lighter touch. In this last update, we did decide to do a full environmental impact statement, again, to look at some different rates of growth and different alternatives. We also wanted to look more closely at our transportation system, because again, that's always a pinch point here in Seattle. So that technical work was helpful in looking at some of the alternatives that we were thinking about. But it may not be quite as extensive as the process that you have in New York, because what we do here is we have we call it a programmatic review. So again, it's not to the level of detail as if you're doing an actual rezoning, because there isn't any immediate zoning change that happens when you adopt the comprehensive plan. Existing zoning regulations stay in effect until they change. The comprehensive plan provides direction for where those changes can happen, but until those changes are made, permitting decisions are made on whatever the current regulations are. So that's how that works here, in that transition between comprehensive plan policy and zoning regulations.
Thank you.
Sal?
Ms. Carroll, first let me say that I'm a big fan of Seattle. We had two of your fellow citizens testify a couple of weeks ago on democracy vouchers, which I think is the gold standard for campaign finance. So just as an aside, the question I have is, in general, has the comprehensive plan in Seattle made the land use process lengthier and more expensive?
I wasn't here in Seattle when they didn't have a comprehensive plan, so I'm not sure I can make that direct comparison. But I think because we look to the current regulations to guide permitting decisions, that it hasn't made it longer. Although there are some folks who, if they kind of see a process happening and that there might be some changes, they might choose to wait and see if there'll be future zoning changes before they make a decision about their properties. So I can say that for some of the land use categories, we do have a future land use map, which is kind of a generalized zoning map in our comprehensive plan. And in order to change zoning in our manufacturing and are designated manufacturing industrial centers. So in order to change a zoning designation from industrial to non-industrial use within those areas does require a change in the comprehensive plan. So that does add an extra step to somebody looking for to request different zoning, to make a zoning change, either if the city wants to initiate that change or a private party does. So that does add an extra step to the process. And also we still have some pretty strong policies around single family areas. And so those are also another place where it may be more difficult to make those zoning changes as quickly as you could in a mixed use or commercial area.
Thank you. Satish, I believe you're next.
Thank you all. My first question is for Mr. Slatkin. I've read this a few times, this statement, and I can't get a sense, maybe it's late, where exactly you come down on the issue of comprehensive planning. Is it that we already do this to some degree? Is it that we have, so if you could just answer that particular question, and especially in light of what's been described as Seattle's planning process. So if you could weigh in on that.
Sure. With respect to comprehensive planning, and I think that we prefer to consider this in the terms of strategic planning, rather than a sort of multi-year process that's based on laying out a future condition of the city that we would then reach through a series of future decisions. We look at the condition of the city today, the issues that are pressing, including the ones that we hear about directly from the public, as well as what we learn through analyzing data about land use development, housing throughout the city, and set priorities and undertake strategic initiatives based on that information. You'll see that there are documents such as in this administration, One NYC, and in the prior administration, Plan YC, that lay out some of the consistent themes and planning objectives of, for instance, how we approach growth and transit-oriented development. In this administration, the increased focus on equity and creating economically diverse communities through planning. And those are principles that we then apply through the individual initiatives that we undertake, and those are themes that are articulated for others to undertake land use action. So when, for instance, the City Planning Commission reviews a proposal, it can hold it up against some of those broader principles and identify whether it seems to be consistent with the broader way that we're thinking about these issues. So I think the issue is really one of a sort of scale and process, and what we are doing is strategic planning on a kind of ongoing basis and refreshing it regularly. I think that another important thing is also, as this commission is thinking about the charter and the structure of the charter, that it is important to hold elected officials accountable for the decisions and the priorities they set, and therefore it's important to enable newly elected mayors, borough presidents to articulate their priorities for the direction that the issues that they see as pressing and important, in order to enable actions to be taken to advance addressing those issues. I would say that I don't want to impugn anything that Seattle does. I think Seattle's a wonderful city too. It's different from New York. That's one of the great things about different cities, is that we each have our own sort of unique characteristics and qualities. I think not only are we different in our scale of something on the order of 12 times the population, I think, of the city of Seattle, but also we have a very different sort of administrative context and, for instance, relationship with state law, and we don't have state and regional planning consistency requirements, sort of that kind of top-down framework that does exist in some other states. It means that New York City, in essence, has to lay out its own strategies more independently, and we do that, and we have consistently done that.
Nicely plansplained. Thank you.
Allison?
So this question is for Mr. Slatkin. You mentioned the ongoing strategic planning work that the department does and the each individual administration does, whether One NYC or Plan YC or what have you. And in the very comprehensive briefing document that the staff put together for us before this hearing, I think I counted no less than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 sort of various reports or processes that one could, to Commissioner Bean's point, consider a comprehensive plan. So maybe this question is not solely for you, but for the whole panel. Is there anything that can be done under the current planning constructs that exist to make them more accessible to the public, to make them more understandable, and to have them relate to one another in a more comprehensive way that could better inform the department, the city council, the administration in terms of the zoning and land use process?
Right. I will start, and others may be interested in adding to what I have to say. I think that in essence what you've seen in recent years with things like One NYC is an effort to do that and to, I think in my remarks I referred to the motivations and the intentions of the 1989 Charter Commission in trying to create a function that enabled professional expertise and objective information to be brought to bear on the process, not to dominate the process and not to exclude community input or other kinds of public participation, but to make sure that it is brought to bear on decision making. The exact instruments by which that was laid out in the Charter and with great specificity have proven not to be the most effective or relevant mechanisms. I think you can go back and explore some of the strategic policy statements and other reports that were produced in the early years following the '89 Charter. And I think, as Sandy said, we have them in our library, but they're not widely used or seen. And I think in part because they're not very accessible. They're highly technical and somewhat obscure documents. And I think that the effort that you've seen with things like One NYC is to make sure that there is a document that lays out these priorities and strategies in a way that is accessible and that does make linkages across, so it's not a bunch of individual plans for, not just a plan for the waterfront and a plan for housing and a plan for, but how these plans relate to one another, and talk about how transit-oriented development involves both planning for housing and planning for jobs that people can reach from that housing, and transportation that helps people get to all those destinations, and integrating that. So I think that what we have done in the spirit of strategic planning under the current charter has been to try to create better instruments for doing that. And I think it is also something, as the Commission thinks about how to lay out processes in the Charter, to be mindful that when you're doing something for the first time, you may or may not have exactly all the steps in the process figured out, and that it's important to allow the parties assigned the responsibility for doing this work to figure out the best and most effective and appropriate ways of executing it.
I was just going to add to what Howard said, that I do think that there is certainly room for improvement in the sort of coherence of the message that is given about what the comprehensive vision of the city is in this administration and any other administration. And so I think we might suggest that rather than thinking about imposing a new comprehensive planning requirement, that we look at articulating how we want to enhance the mechanisms that we already have to be better and more effective at articulating what it is we want to do. So I think your question there was right on point.
If I can just add to that, on the basis of the work that I did on Housing New York, I think that a great deal of what you're asking about, Commissioner Hirsch, is actually already being done. So when we developed the Housing New York plan, we involved more than 20 different agencies. There was an enormous amount of cross-fertilization and collaboration and an understanding of how what we were doing with Housing New York affected what city planning was doing, what transportation was doing, et cetera, right? The other thing is that there is a way of tying it together and making it more accessible and ensuring accountability, which is the Mayor's Management Report feeds off of all of those strategic initiatives, all of those strategic plans. And so we reported every year, I think actually every 6 months, how we were doing on all of the things that were laid out in those strategic plans. And that's all online. It's very accessible. And it does tell people how this all fits together and what it's all working towards. So I'm sure there are ways to improve it, but there's a great deal already being done.
I would just want to add an observation as I listen to this. Each time one of these reports gets done, I think people learn a little more about improving the process and trying it to do so. But I think there's an underlying tension that always results in people being disappointed. So this administration, which I'm not a part of and I have no stake in other than as a citizen, has the most aggressive affordable housing program in the nation. You will not attend a community meeting where, and let me just say, thanks to the people on either side of me and others, they're achieving their goals. But you won't find at a public meeting on housing people saying, you're solving the housing problem, because the housing problem is bigger than their ability to solve it. And people turn to the process and say, well, there's a fault in the process. You know, if the tools that are available, the amount of money that are available, are not as big as some of the problems we face. And that can apply to the subways, it applies to the school system, it applies to children's services, it applies all across the board. And a lot of what I think people hear is the inability of the people who have to sit at these tables from the government side to be able to give people things that they legitimately need and maybe deserve, but you know, the city spends all the money it collects, and at the end of the day, it doesn't have more money to spend.
Great, thank you very much. I have one follow-up question, if that's okay, Chairperson. Yes. One issue that's come up a number of times in the public comments prior to this hearing around comprehensive planning is the need for more equitable fair share policies across the city. And while the move in the 1975 charter and 1989 charter was towards local engagement in the zoning process, which is laudable and makes sense, it also potentially helped exacerbate the idea that certain communities get more than their fair share of waste transfer stations, homeless shelters, et cetera. And so my understanding, and I guess we'll hear more in the next panel, that one of the proponents of a comprehensive plan see in expanding the fair share more equitably, the sort of burdens more equitably across communities. So I would say my understanding is all of you are advocating for this system as is more than a broader comprehensive plan. Are there any ways that you can speak to sort of under the current system ensuring that those kinds of homeless shelter sightings, waste transfer stations, et cetera, are more equitably distributed across the city?
Well, let me dive in there, and then we can have a broader discussion. But I think part of the tension and part of the reason why comprehensive plans turn out to be disappointing in the end is that defining what is fair is actually very, very difficult. And that is a political question with a capital P and a small p. And that's a discussion that we need to have. There was somewhat of a discussion around the fair share criteria about what fairness actually meant and how things get distributed equitably. But that's a conversation that is, first of all, incredibly controversial, incredibly fraught, and incredibly difficult. And there's no reason to believe that comprehensive planning would actually make any progress on that question, right? Much of the criticism of the fair share criteria is that they are like an environmental impact review. All you have to do is show that you considered the fairness of the distribution. You don't have to meet any numerical or other target because one wasn't set because it's too difficult of a question for most, it's too difficult of a question, right? And so there's no reason to believe that moving the question into what we call a comprehensive planning system would accomplish anything other than what is accomplished in the conversation about fair share.
I'd like to jump in here too. So it's useful to think out what would fair share mean in terms of the various things. And actually, there was an attempt to do homeless
numerical
shelters,
system,
right? And I believe one of all the shelters that were proposed, one for 100 women in Park Slope was opened. All of the others were not moved forward. But let's just take waste transfer stations. So we put them in M zones, the city. I shouldn't say we anymore, but the city puts them in M zones, and there were a very limited number of those. So you could either say, well, we won't put them in the M zone anymore because the M zones already have all kinds of things that people don't want, which means we're going to have to put them in other zones where even more people live. And I would venture to say that that is a political question with a bigger capital P and one that's not likely to happen. And that's what happened with homeless shelters. It wasn't that communities disagreed with the distribution of homeless shelters that already existed. That it was that the communities that didn't have homeless shelters felt they already had too many things in their community, whether they were drug treatment, whether they were, whatever they were, that they were already overburdened. And so the notion that fair share is somehow going to solve the problem of what people are willing to accept as an inconvenient use of their neighborhood. They're concerned about crime, they're concerned about what it's going to do to their property values, they're concerned about all kinds of things, some of which you might feel are valid, some of which you might feel invalid. But in the political process, all those things come out. And so the charter mandate doesn't really wind up distributing things in a way that some people would like. And you wind up with what fair share does do, which is it provides an explanation. It makes you look at what the other options are and provides an explanation for why those particular choices were chosen. And then the political process decides if they're going to use those sites that get selected.
I would just add that in listening to this conversation, it really strikes me that, we've seen tonight the dichotomy of what is being requested here. On the one hand, people are looking for more community control over decision making, which actually we know will lead to more problems in regards to citing things that people don't want in their neighborhoods. And this notion that somehow, on the other hand, if we can do comprehensive planning, that we will solve these problems. What I would really submit is that that is not correct, and that in order to come to a consensus about comprehensive planning, we will have the exact same dynamics that we have in terms of neighborhoods desiring to ensure that they get exactly what they want in their neighborhood, as opposed to thinking citywide. So for me, that really goes back to what I think is essential, is to remember that the prior balance of power that was struck in part to ensure that the city executive had the ability to take a citywide view in terms of how things got cited that people in parochial neighborhoods may not be interested in having cited, and to just not believe that, to say that we're going to empower community engagement and neighborhood involvement and then have comprehensive planning is going to solve this problem, because I just don't see any reason to think that's true.
Commissioner Vaca?
Yes, very quickly, I appreciate everything that you've just stated. I think that deciding what is fair is difficult, subjective. Deciding when there is a saturation point, every neighborhood will say they are saturated. Every neighborhood will say they are treated unfairly. I just do want to note yesterday, speaking for my borough of the Bronx, that a report came out that we are number 62 out of 62 counties in the state. We are the unhealthiest county. This is like the 10th year or the 12th year we've been rated so low. Every health variable, every type of education variable is like out of whack in the Bronx. So we're not talking fairness or saturation, we're talking inequality just as much as we're talking. And how do you measure it? Well, planners have to look at reports like this and then say, are we going to put another marine transfer station in the Bronx? Are we going to continue to dump someplace where traditionally these things have been placed that can no longer take? I mean, Manhattan has one of the highest life expectancies in the state. Manhattan at 85.4. The Bronx is number 62 out of 62. We're at 80. Wow, you live 5 years more living in Manhattan than you would in the Bronx? This is just, this survey, I'd like you to all see this because you're in a position. Planners. I think this is a problem of inequality in my borough and inadequate access, but I think that rather than talk about fairness and saturation because we cannot define it, I think we have to talk of studies that are in place that give you facts before we start citing facilities. These studies are not subjective. This is the reality. And we already have this information at our fingertips, and we don't use it when we plan. We plan in a vacuum.
Carl? We have another panel.
This is a very, hopefully, reasonably quick question to Sandy Hornick. I finally found someone who was at the Department of City Planning when City Planning and the Office of Management and Budget did the capital plan together at the same time. When we think about planning, frequently we think about where the resources of the city are allocated and where our capital investments and our infrastructure investments are made, recognizing that that's a big issue for neighborhoods, not just the siting of growth, but also the ability of our infrastructure to keep pace with that growth. And I'm wondering, you've cited, and Howard and others have cited, a number of plans and programs, comprehensive programs that the city has undertaken. Would a stronger relationship between the Office of Management and Budget and city planning on the creation of the 10-year capital strategy or a 10-year capital plan that took much closer cognizance of issues of where growth is occurring, where communities, as Commissioner Vaca indicated, are suffering, are lagging in terms of health and the like. And planning was a greater factor in that 10-year capital strategy. Would that address concerns about comprehensive planning, and would that make for a more effective city? Going back to when you started as city planning, when that was done jointly.
Well, but I started in 1975. During the height of the fiscal crisis, there was no capital budget to speak of. So there was no
Maybe that's why they could do it together.
Which, by the way, is why I think, not that he consulted me, Bobby Wagner, when he was chair, was willing to give it up because we had no capacity to do it and there wasn't much going on in the budget anyway. It certainly would help to have more ability to target resources to places. I know in the Bloomberg administration we did rezonings, we dealt with OMB, and basically the deputy mayors and the mayor made those kinds of things happen to an extent. Although I learned later that agencies would get called and be forced to make a commitment to resources, but they were often committing the same resources over and over again because, in fact, the budget wasn't actually getting bigger. So it's like playing SimCity, which I did 20 years ago, and you can only spend the money that you have. So it's hard to say. The other thing about being involved in it, city planning was always a junior partner, and I'm always reminded what somebody said, who was George Steinbrenner's junior partner in the Yankees, which is there's nothing more junior than being George Steinbrenner's junior partner. And that was also true of city planning and OMB. So, to the extent that one could really shape where those budgetary resources go, but it's very difficult because in the end, and I'm curious actually, how many people work in the Seattle Department of City Planning? Right, ma'am?
Patrice?
Yeah, so we have a staff of about 50, and that also includes some staff that supports our planning commission, and we also have a design commission that reviews the design of public projects.
Okay, so that's a little higher than our ratio. When we had a capital budget, what we had were a handful of people who were expert in each item. So we had one person who was a schools expert, and one person was it. We just never had the kind of depth that either the agencies themselves had naturally or that OMB had. So it's a lot of resources that you need to be able to do that fully. But I do think you're right. It would help to have that kind of coordination better.
Can I just make a point that ties, Carl, your question back to Commissioner Vaca's point, and that is that there is another process that's going on in order to address the equality question, which is the fair housing conversation that's going on, the process that HPD is using with many of the agencies. It's called Where We Live, but it's designed to exactly address the question of what are the inequalities and why are they there and how do they map onto race and all kinds of other things. And it includes the question of where our capital budget dollars are being spent and where money is pouring into a community or not pouring into a community. That's the kind of strategic planning initiative that the city does in many ways, and I think is a much more effective and targeted way to approach those kinds of questions.
And I know the question was not directed to me, and I've only logged 19 years at city planning, so I'll try to keep my...
You're such a child, Howard.
I know. I'll keep my response to at least no more than half the length of Sandy's response.
And you're from Brooklyn, so I'm not sure you can address a Bronx question.
I'm from New York City. The citywide perspective. I do want to put in a plug for something that my colleague John Kaufman described on a previous panel before this commission, which is the role that city planning has been taking with OMB in crafting the draft 10-year capital strategy. And I actually encourage people to look at the recently released draft 10-year capital strategy, which does identify, it does take advantage of all the data and resources that city planning has at its disposal to look at where are the neighborhoods that have been experiencing the most rapid housing unit growth recently, and obviously we'll add to that population growth when new census data become available. But to take that information to supply it not only to OMB but also to the capital agencies that need to make use of that data in a timely way so that you can have really, essentially real-time use of data about where growth is happening and where the next 5 years and the next 10 years are going to require investment.
Carl, then Paula? Or did you just...
So this is a little bit of a repeat, but I'd like to ask, do we need in the charter to codify better that One NYC is our strategic plan and that we should be tying other plans to it and that the management report should tie to it? Is there a need to strengthen that?
Well, I think one thing is that, it's to the extent that the current reports mandated in the charter are not particularly helpful or informative in the forms that they're specified. We like to adhere to the letter of the charter where possible, but in this instance, I think that there are better practices. I think I would recommend that the Commission proceed with some caution, though, in terms of specifying the exact form that plan or planning process should take, because there are probably different ways to address it, and certainly there have been different approaches to determining the precise scope and the subject matter of the plan. But one thing that is useful, that is embedded in the charter, in the plan, the long-term sustainability plan requirements, not in the 1989 charter provisions, is specifying that long-term planning is conducted based on a time frame and a set of projections for population growth or population change that is sufficiently long-term to make a practical or a vision for the foreseeable future for the city. So I think the idea that planning should occur with that type of time horizon and based on projections for what future conditions are likely to be in the city, I think is a valuable notion.
Thank you.
I don't see any further questions, so I would like to thank all of you for your participation and hope that we can call upon you again with both potentially proposals or to get more information from you as we further examine this whole area of planning. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I know, but it's a pain to carry it because you run into everything in the street.
Finally, we have our third panel, and we will be joined by Councilmember Antonio Reynoso, Tom Angadi, Elena Conti, Jessica Katz, and Malin Mehta. Please go ahead and introduce yourselves, share any initial comments you may have. Each of you will have 3 minutes, and then there will be time provided for questioning by the members of the Commission. Thank you very much for joining us all, and you can decide amongst yourself who should proceed.
Good evening, panel. Very happy to be here. I think this is the first time I'm testifying on this side of the table.
How does it feel?
It's scary. You have so much control. Take it easy on me, Carl. I have this testimony here that I'll leave to you to read in time, but after hearing the last panel, I just felt like I needed to address some concerns that I have. First, it would be hard-pressed to think of the last panel as planners. I feel like the Grinch stole their little planning heart. I just feel that a lot of the case being made is so uninspired, and I think that we as a city are anything but that. And challenges that do arise, we're so good at being able to tackle them or address these issues. So just to hear them speak was concerning. What we've come to become as a city is an unaffordable, economically and racially segregated city who could be underwater in a few decades. These are crises that are not being addressed, are not being addressed, and if they are being addressed by limited piecemeal planning. Equity, we talk about waste transfer stations and whether or not it's it's a political game. When my district, one district in the city of New York, handled 40% of the city's trash, it was piecemeal planning, a non-comprehensive plan that thought one district could handle 20,000 tons of trash. That was their planning, not comprehensive planning. There is no plan for the Bronx. You're relegated to the status quo unless you contribute significantly to gentrifying development or you grow in political influence. It's the only way that you can affect change in the city of New York at this moment. That's what we've come to tell our communities, that should you want to have significant influence in how your community is planned, you either need to be affluent or have extremely significant, again, political influence. And I don't think that that's necessarily true. I think that as a city we can do better. I think that we can tell communities that everyone is responsible for taking care of New York City. Everyone is responsible for taking on burdens that are difficult to bear, like waste transfer stations, like homeless shelters, like affordable housing. Those things need to happen. I played a political game in this city council for 5 years to address the issue of capacity in waste transfer stations. The Upper East Side fought for 4 years through lawsuits because they had the money, fighting against 800 tons of capacity in their district when my district had 20,000 tons. That's not how we should be planning in this city. It shouldn't happen one step at a time. It shouldn't happen one council member at a time. We should have a thoughtful process and truly believe that we can plan as a city, that planning is real. And I believe that we can do that. And that is why we're standing here today, because there has to be a better way. Because as of now, the planning that exists has left us an unaffordable, racially segregated, economically segregated city in a climate crisis. So thank you.
Red light on, it's on.
It's on. Okay, great. Good evening, and thank you so much for the opportunity to testify. My name is Elena Conti, and I am the Director of Policy at the Pratt Center for Community Development, which has been working closely with the Thriving Communities Coalition. I have more than 15 years of experience working for and with community-based organizations in low-income communities of color, and my organization has been dedicated to supporting the planning and implementation efforts of these communities for close to 60 years. That description doesn't do justice to what the work is. A community-based plan is both process and product that elicits and then codifies a collective set of values into a practical roadmap to manifest them. Pratt Center believes that comprehensive planning framework has the potential to mirror this process at a citywide level, and my mission tonight is to describe how such an effort, by actively engaging local communities throughout, represents our only real promise to achieve the citywide goals of equity and justice. A comprehensive planning framework respects the expertise of local communities to determine and articulate their own needs, and also charges and trusts them with contributing to the betterment of the city as a whole. This is a radical departure from our current ad hoc system, which is dominated by as-of-right land use actions and review. It is ineffective, polarizing, and disempowering to most communities. Much of the contention in local land use battles can be traced to, 1, longstanding unmet needs unaddressed. 2, the lack of genuine engagement in the process, where instead of being asked to co-create plans, communities are pushed into reactionary positions. And in some cases, 3, exclusionary tendencies. Comprehensive planning addresses each of these. It provides for, 1, an acknowledgement and assessment of the impact of previous planning practices, including racist disinvestment and redlining, through a statement of principles and values to guide the framework, a comprehensive data-driven needs assessment that provides greater information about neighborhoods and their relationship to others across a slate of critical measures, including residential displacement risk and economic and educational opportunity, and an emphasis on investing in areas of greatest need and budgetary alignment of commitments for capital project and programmatic expenditures. It can also, 2, create the opportunity to participate in and co-create the citywide equity-based collective goals that guide the framework. This would be, instead of goals that are solely determined by the mayor and announced in various, as we've heard, and sometimes conflicting, which we did in here, policy documents by different agencies, all of which have different or non-existent reporting requirements. And third, it would create the responsibility and opportunity to engage in neighborhood-based planning that contributes to the well-being of the whole city and the reduction of inequality. The current system not only allows but encourages neighborhoods to only consider the local impact of a proposal, giving them a free pass from grappling with the hard questions how to balance our interconnectedness and interdependence, questions they are fully capable of tackling when properly supported to articulate a proactive vision. At the same time, neighborhood-level planning that has official standing will increase participation, generate new ideas, and organize the community around a vision. In sum, a comprehensive planning framework is the way to repair our broken piecemeal system by integrating and aligning planning, policymaking, and the budget in an intentional way to achieve our equity goals. A planning framework, just like the budget that should be attached to it, is an expression of our values. Failing to create a comprehensive framework for our city has fostered our dramatic failure to address inequality. We can and must do better. We and our partners have worked extensively on concrete proposals for how to achieve these goals, and we look forward to working closely with you to craft a proposal for the ballot and also to following up with more extensive written testimony. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Agnotti? Angotti, I'm sorry.
Thank you. I'm Tom Angotti, Emeritus Professor of Urban Planning at Hunter College in the Graduate Center, formerly a senior planner at the City Planning Department. I've been a professional planner for 50 years and a community planner for more than 50 years. First of all, the way you win a debate in debating in high school is you set up a straw man. So if you want to win a debate on comprehensive planning, all you have to do is project that comprehensive planning is this time-consuming, wasteful exercise that produces nothing of value. The other thing you can do is engage in a little magical thinking, which is that the problem we have today is all about growth. And what the city has to do is grow, and anything that interferes with growth is wrong. And you know what gets our neighborhoods, our communities, our citizens angry is when you don't listen to all of the other things they care about besides growth. So I have a written testimony which you will see. It's a short summary in 3 pages, but I'm going to go through them very quickly. Yes to comprehensive planning. It's long overdue in New York City, and stop giving me excuses why New York can't do what other cities around the world do. Let's go to Amsterdam. After all, this was New Amsterdam. They're still doing comprehensive planning. But I'm against comprehensive planning without community-based planning, because that is what you need to inform a real plan that is rooted in the reality and the everyday life and problems and issues that people feel in the city. If you're sitting in an office in the city planning department and are trying to dream up a scheme for the long-term future of the city by yourself, what you wind up is an agency strategic plan, but not a real plan that's going to help guide political decision-making for the long-term future. So we need community-based planning. It's broken. There's a long history of community-based planning. I was one of the founders of the task force and campaign on community-based planning, which was strongly backed by the environmental justice movement. Why? Because communities of color were being dumped on all the time and fought in order to rid themselves of noxious facilities. And as soon as they did so, the land values and rents went up, and they faced displacement. Already?
Nope.
So unless you have planning, you can't really solve the problem, and that's why community-based planners and the environmental justice movement are in the forefront of community-based and comprehensive planning. And I just want to add a couple of things. You need long-term and middle-range planning, not just the 20, 30, 40, 50-year plan for the future. Comprehensive planning is not just a product, it's a process. It has to be inclusive, exhaustive, deliberative, and just. Those are goals. Will we achieve them? That's up to us. You have to look at multiple scenarios, not just one. You have to balance growth and preservation. And then each of the agencies that has the name planning in it, and the Planning Commission as well, need to be restructured and reoriented to a different way of doing planning. I think we have to change the culture that all we can do is plan for the next development, and all we can do is plan for the next wave of growth, which, by the way, after every single growth spurt in the history, study the figures, study the data, homelessness goes up. Instead of, you build all these housing units, and we still have a huge housing deficit for the people who need it the most. And so you need affordable housing programs that aren't truly affordable. So the final point, I think, is comprehensive planning does not homogenize, should not. It should actually help us to deal with our differences, our diversity, our cultural, racial diversity. And then finally, I think we have to think about the region, because we are a central part. We are the largest municipality in the region.
Thank you, Professor. Mr. Mitta?
Thank you for giving us the opportunity to talk to you today, and thank you for all the work you guys have been doing. My name is Maulan Mehta. I'm a senior associate at the Regional Plan Association. RPA is a nearly 100-year-old nonprofit civic organization that conducts advocacy, research, and planning for improved opportunity, mobility, and sustainability in the New York City metropolitan region. Our fourth regional plan provides a blueprint for shared prosperity developed through a values-driven approach. We work with a range of stakeholders, including community groups, governments, and business leaders, to create a comprehensive vision for 31 counties across 3 states. This big picture approach should never replace the hard work of community planning that, when done right, creates partnership between communities and decision makers to implement projects, programs, and policies to address immediate and long-term needs. However, the reactionary nature of planning in the city today has led to a breakdown in accountability, predictability, and equity in the planning process. We've reached a situation where wealthy communities with power and marginalized communities with decades of neglect are united in blocking investments in their neighborhoods because they no longer trust the objectivity of the process. We need to get away from siloed frameworks and do something different. Comprehensive planning undertaken by most big cities in the U.S. would move us to a proactive approach in developing our city. Done right, it would objectively and equitably establish citywide targets based on shared values, ensure we plan for both existing and new communities, and give more deference to community plans. Local planning, development, and policies would align with citywide goals established through a comprehensive evaluation of existing and future needs. We could do this in a few ways. Some examples: incentivize some aligned plans by fast-tracking development and requiring parties that object to certain projects to prove that alignment is not happening. We could also ensure that decisions in capital and expense budgeting align with a comprehensive plan while still allowing flexibility to address urgent or unanticipated needs. We've heard concerns that this type of a plan could be outdated by the time it's completed. Across the pond, the London Plan has successfully cycled through multiple administrations and is regularly updated to provide a framework for strategic development. This plan is required by their governing charter, which lays out some basic values and limitations that need to be taken into account by each subsequent mayor. One of the biggest concerns about that plan is how it coordinates with capital budgeting, since the mayor has little control over the biggest investment resources necessary to implement plan recommendations, and we share similar concerns for the city. However, comprehensive planning can still be a functional framework for us. We can set rules so that a portion of capital dollars are set aside for addressing disinvestment and other inequities, as the Parks Department has done through their Community Parks Initiative. Unfortunately, we see evidence that the city is moving further and further from comprehensive planning. For example, the city has been relying more and more on smaller rezonings, doubling the frequency of map amendments since 2016 compared to the prior 15 years for areas that are on average 6 times smaller. Oftentimes, community boards do not have strict requirements and resources for robust engagement when formulating their needs assessments, which is not seen as a thorough representation of local needs and goals by a lot of community groups. New charter reforms should either establish an independent body to carry out robust community engagement and transparent data gathering and analysis, or enforce that existing bodies be independent. This independent body can also be tasked with regularly assessing and changing technical processes and track mitigation enforcement to be more predictive of policy and land use decision impacts. The process should be transparent, easily updatable, and accessible by everyone. Charter reform should focus on simplifying our land use process and implementing values-driven requirements that align planning, expenditures, and processes that will be used to create a holistic roadmap for the city. This roadmap should be flexible in accommodating existing populations while addressing the new generation of infrastructure and investment. Thank you again for your time, and we intend on submitting formal written testimony in the coming days, and we're happy to include written comments to any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mehta. Ms. Katz?
Hi. Hello, Chair Benjamin and fellow commissioners. Thank you for inviting me to testify here today. My name is Jessica Katz. I'm the Executive Director of the Citizens Housing and Planning Council. Since our founding in 1937, CHPC has sought to advance practical public policies to support the housing stock in New York City by better understanding New York's most pressing housing and neighborhood needs. New York City's land use and planning process, while imperfect, is far more robust, transparent, and predictable than the majority of its counterparts in other cities. While it is often reviled by developers, city agencies, and community activists alike, as the old saying goes, you've heard this a few times tonight, the mark of a good compromise is when all parties are equally unhappy. Our city's land use process is by no means perfect, but it stood the test of time. So any changes should be weighed carefully, and CHPC commends the Commission for its diligent work on this Herculean task. CHPC believes that our planning process should meet the following goals: balance local and citywide perspectives, incorporate accurate data, address the needs of both current and future residents of New York, be decision-driven, and provide better ways for neighbors and communities to participate and stay informed. Any improvements to our current system should make it easier for New Yorkers to say yes to local land use actions they support, not simply create new ways to say no. This means raising our standards for how we inform communities about planning and finding better ways for New Yorkers to express their needs and preferences. Our current system tends to amplify only the voices of those who have the time and the temperament to testify at hearings. Decisions on individual projects can seem to lack context or data, and too many stakeholders feel excluded from the process. Our system rests on the premise that building more has an impact, but we often fail to consider the consequences of doing nothing. As some of you know, my background is in supportive housing, and so I'm particularly concerned about the 60,000 homeless people who tend not to show up to community board meetings, but whose needs are clearly not well met by our current system. Other cities have interesting mechanisms in place to encourage the development of more affordable housing, such as the Chapter 40B process in Massachusetts. It's a delight to be here tonight among the planning nerds of New York City to discuss these issues, and I truly believe that many of the panelists share more values than we might expect. But here's the bad news. We at CHPC don't see any evidence that comprehensive planning would help achieve these goals or advance these shared values. CHPC is concerned that charter revision is not a nimble enough tool to engage in this type of comprehensive planning, which has not been undertaken at this scale or intensity. A comprehensive plan would take enormous time and resources. The plan would be outdated before the ink was dry. And while we can write a plan into the charter, New York City is already replete with plans, and the charter cannot guarantee that a comprehensive plan would be useful, meaningful, or taken seriously. One of the other recommendations submitted to this commission is radical in its simplicity, and I think provides a wonderful framework for us to assess the charter revisions themselves. I actually don't know who submitted this, but I just want to state for the record, I would like to buy that person a beer. The recommendation is as follows. Require that all legislation identify A, the problem it is intended to solve, the means by which it addresses such a problem, the metrics that will be used to determine its success or failure, and the appropriate grounds for sunset. At CHPC, we wish we had thought of this ourselves, and we're not convinced that comprehensive planning passes such a test. So while we're always in search of new ideas to improve our system for housing and planning, charter revision is too blunt a tool to make such a change in such a short period of time. Thank you.
Thank you. The first person I have is Sal. Anyone else? Satish?
Professor Angotti, welcome. You've heard all of the criticism and feedback about the negatives of comprehensive planning tonight. It's too costly. It's lengthy. By the time the ink is dried, it's outdated. Have you done any analysis of comprehensive planning across the country or across the world? You mentioned Amsterdam. How do they do this? And is the criticism that this could cripple development in the city fair?
Well, the cities that have comprehensive planning continue to grow and develop. I don't see them limiting or constricting development, although they do help to shape development. They also help municipalities, regional governments to plan for infrastructure that is needed in order to support growth and in order to address existing problems of public health and the environment. Of course, we're becoming a little bit like Amsterdam because portions of the city are going to be underwater in a not too distant future. And there is a lesson there for us, because if we don't begin to do long-term comprehensive planning, 4 or 5 decades and more ahead, we are going to be facing crises in the long-term future. Amsterdam dealt with it over its entire history. But of course, there are many other cities around the world we could have a very long discussion about. And there are many examples of comprehensive plans that are useless. No question about it. So it really depends on how you approach it. Is it just to produce a piece of paper, or is it to engage in a process that allows for an open, democratic, participatory process where you can get out on the table all of the potential scenarios, all of the potential possibilities, and in which you invite citizens to participate? So it isn't just a plan that's invented in the cabinet by a group of technocrats. Although there are many technocratic plans that are actually quite good and are implemented, it's better to have one that your citizens can believe in and participate in. And by the way, if environment is one of the top concerns, those concerns are coming from the grassroots, from environmental organizations, neighborhood organizations that are dealing with contamination and environmental hazards on a day-to-day basis and are putting the big solutions on the table. The first major revision of the city's long-range solid waste plan was the result of over a decade of organizing by a coalition of environmental justice groups that demanded a more equitable distribution of waste transfer stations around the city. And they were successful, in large part. And so, yes, comprehensive planning, it has many possibilities, but it depends on what we do with it. And if we do depend only on the technicians and the professionally trained planners, and there are many good professionally trained planners, but they alone cannot do it. So I am very concerned about a process that's constricted to the inner workings of the planning agency, which, by the way, doesn't do any planning. They do zoning. Zoning is not planning. Zoning is a very weak tool for land use control, and that's a universal principle that most planners outside New York City will agree. Zoning is a weak tool for getting housing built. You can't build low-income housing without deep public subsidies. Zoning can help, but by itself, it does not do it. So that's comprehensive planning.
Have you reviewed other charters or other city documents that include comprehensive planning in their charter and their constitution? Any one of you, or what I'm driving at is, are we the proper vehicle, as was pointed out, to drive the comprehensive planning strategy? Is this the way to? Is the charter the way to do it, or do we do it? Is it legislation that's needed, or what have you?
Yes, the state mandates comprehensive planning. Most other large municipalities in New York State do it. New York City has gotten away with not doing it through a sleight of hand. They say the zoning resolution is our comprehensive plan. That, on the face of it, is absurd. It's a neat little legal argument to get the city out of the bind of doing something they don't really want to do, and give up the control over development. So we are perfectly.
I'm not sure that's actually quite fair. I think what the city says is that the comprehensive plan is contained in a number of documents, including the zoning resolution, the housing plan, the 10-year capital plan, and a number of other documents that Howard spoke about earlier.
That's very clever.
And just politically, to allow it to go through a legislative process, Sal, you know better than anyone how politics works in the city of New York. And if you ever wanted to remove anecdotes and personal experiences from doing a good job at pushing a comprehensive plan, then the legislative process isn't the way to go. You don't want council members negotiating against themselves to build something out that would be meaningful. You want that to happen through other means. So I wouldn't want it to come to our body to go through that process. I don't think we would be able to do it the right way. I actually do feel that this is the only way we can get change done in a meaningful way.
Fair enough.
Sorry. Satish is next, and the Honorable Jimmy Vaca, and then Allison Hirsch.
Thank you all for your testimony. I walked in here without a set view on this topic, but after hearing from your prior panelists and from all of you, my question is very simple. What is the mechanism, or what is it that we would put into the charter that would help accomplish these goals, which I think we all share? We all want these things for New York City, but what is it that we would put? And I want to refer to Professor Bean's statement about being on this continuum from specificity to vagueness. Where do we land on that? And how do we make sure that this works and accomplishes these goals? That's what I'm missing.
All right, let me try. It's a big question, and I want to offer that I think that a lot of the statements that were made with regard to considering comprehensive planning framework this evening by folks who are not in favor of it are very true statements, right? So I think it's absolutely accurate that we have to be very smart and specific about what actually should go in the charter, right? And we're not writing up a whole mandate for a plan, right? There's a role for technocrats, there's a role for the mayor, but there are certain key elements, and we're happy to talk a lot more with staff. I don't know how well this can get answered in this forum, but I will say that there are certain components that I think do make sense, right? And also to Commissioner Albanese's question, yes, lots of charters have language about comprehensive planning, and they often all include a statement of principles about what it is geared towards, right? And that's something that Jessica was talking about, like, what are we aiming at? Why are we doing this, right? So that's one component of it. There are others. Obviously, it's the creating it. I think it is also strengthening the role of community boards and the standing of community plans, right, as one part of feeding into the setting of citywide goals, right? So we are all talking, I think, on this panel at least, about the importance of community-based planning in a comprehensive planning framework, right, and not talking about a master top-down comprehensive plan at all. So let's get rid of that notion, lest it still be in the air somewhere. And how it relates to other pieces that are in the charter, right? How it gets approved, is like a ULURP-like process, right? What happens after that, right? And how it aligns with planning and budget. Those are sort of key pieces that feel appropriate to go in the charter because they speak to the powers that are delineated in the charter. But we can talk more. Is that? And,
can I just add one thing? I think understanding and looking at our history can help us answer some of these questions. In 1975, ULURP was established because neighborhoods were clamoring to get involved in land use decisions and more. They wanted to be involved with schools where their kids go to school. They wanted to be engaged. What we got was a half-baked reform. We are told that community boards, their votes are advisory. You know how insulting that sounds to people who are on community boards? Only advisory. Just like the 197A plan. And in 1989, the charter was changed to allow communities explicit ability to present their community-based plans for approval by the City Planning Commission. And then we're told, oh, but they're only advisory. And the biggest tragedy is some of the most deep community planning processes, like the Williamsburg 197A plan, spent over 10 years doing that plan. And city planning people sat in on it. I was in on many sessions. And it was very contentious. Yes, there were NIMBYites, but there were also people who were welcoming development. Yes, there were ethnic and cultural and racial differences, but you know, people stood with it and they came up with a consensus. And the consensus was, this is what we want. We don't want luxury high-rise buildings on the Williamsburg waterfront. Within 2 years, the city planning department came back with a rezoning plan, the essence of which was luxury high-rise on the waterfront. And they wiped out Williamsburg's mixed-use zoning, which was a unique, original thing that Pratt had a lot to do with establishing, by the way, in Williamsburg. And look at the result. And the final note to this history is now we have giant development on the Brooklyn-Queens waterfront when nobody knows exactly how many feet the sea level is going to rise and how sustainable all of that development is going to be. Whether people are going to have to hitch their boats to the ground floor or whether they'll be able to get out and walk around. So, yeah, I think it's more essential now than ever before.
Yes, I first want to tell Councilman Reynoso I'm going to go easy on you today because you know what it is to be queried in a very strenuous way. I do want to say that I'm in favor of comprehensive planning as a concept. I do think that it needs formalization and more thought. I don't see a way how comprehensive planning can be committed to, because comprehensive planning by nature is long-term. Mayors change, city council people change. So my concern about comprehensive planning is, number one, can it be something that's written in stone? And number two, do we want something that's written in stone? You mentioned inequality. Well, the Bronx is more unequal than anyone else. When I came to this council, I came as a community board district manager. And when I came and I heard the presentation from many of the Manhattan community boards, I heard from doctors and lawyers. I saw the talent that the Manhattan community boards had. And that talent reflects on the power of the board. We in the Bronx don't have those type of people serving on community boards. We have activists, concerned people, church people, but we don't have that type of knowledge on our boards. The boards are only advisory, but to be very honest, the boards have formal power and informal power. The power of a community board is how to use the informal power. Not going to change the city charter overnight. But when you have informal power and you know how to navigate and you have people on the board that can help the district manager, that's power. Don't forget, the community boards were supposed to get planners to level the playing field. Every community board was supposed to get a planner, a professional urban planner. They never did. What did they get? They have the right to issue district resource statements that don't mean the paper they are written on. It would be laughable if it was not so frustrating. How many years I wrote those statements only to get something spit out that told me there's no money, thank you very much. I don't think a bureaucrat anywhere even considered what the community board advocated for. So I do think, and then we come back, of course, that when there is an action on land use, you mentioned about what Williamsbridge waterfront, when there is an issue, and you mentioned many of the things, sir, that I spoke about before, but when there is an action, we depend on the buildings department for enforcement. Well, we're dealing with one hand tied behind our back. We in this city have $1.2 billion in building department and related violations that are not paid. So when you have a toothless agency to begin with, issuing fines that nobody pays and we can't collect, well then what are we talking about comprehensive planning and why are we talking about zoning? Important issues to consider. And I throw them out to you. But my main thrust, of course, is that comprehensive planning sounds good. I just don't know a vehicle to enforce it and to make it real, especially since it's going to be long-term. How do we enforce a comprehensive plan? Mandate what a community finds they want done in a comprehensive plan. That mechanism has not shown itself this evening.
Allison? Oh. Anyone else?
So I wasn't sure if that actually was a question, but I actually could respond to it if that would be useful. Commissioner Vaca, how would it work in this instance? And it's great that you mentioned the community district needs assessment, right? And the lack of consistency across boards, the lack of a pathway for them to result in any dollars coming to a community or any of those things necessarily. Occasionally they result in some investments, but any of those things coming to pass, right? And so the exercise being a challenging one for boards and a frustrating one for boards. I think as we envision, as I was talking about sort of the bottom up and the top down together, these assessments would be more standardized and they would be part of a larger needs assessment that's data-based but also is based in local qualitative knowledge, right? And it would be the combination of these now more detailed, formal, well-supported local statements of need with a citywide look at needs that go beyond the district that would together feed into the creation of the citywide goals that would then be meted out by district. So again, I could go on, and I know it is quite late, so I won't sort of exhaust folks with detail in the plan, but I would like to assure all of the commissioners that there is a lot of thought that has been given to how it might work, right? And that what we're talking about is not a site-by-site, block-by-block plan. We are talking about a framework that would guide both the built environment and social needs, enable some development to move faster when it's consistent, right? And also has systems that strengthen considering the things that are not consistent.
Yeah, and just on the Williamsburg rezoning, when you talk about enforcement, there was an EIS done for the first Williamsburg rezoning, and the EIS is a joke if you read it now about what its impacts, it assumed the impacts would be. It was then rezoned, the Domino portion of it was rezoned again, and a new EIS was done. But nothing was done in the interim to I guess, speak to the mistakes that were made in the original EIS and plan for that. In a comprehensive plan, we would be able to have an opportunity to look back at the mistakes or the shortfalls of the first plan and how we would modify the new plan so that it could address those needs. It's 12 years, the plan to build out the waterfront, and the first rezoning happened in 2006, I believe. So we're maybe 14 years in, about 14 years in, and the EIS doesn't speak to the amount of gentrification and displacement that's happened in Williamsburg and so forth. So I just want you to keep in mind that while we have no enforcement mechanism right now, like the Department of Buildings has a limited enforcement mechanism, is that the EISs themselves right now don't account for realistic goals right now when it comes to impacts in the city.
Allison asked to be back on the list.
Sorry, I had tabled my question, but now the council member made me ask a different question. So you said that if there had been a comprehensive plan in place, then the mistakes and oversights that were made in the original Greenpoint Williamsburg rezoning would have been able to have been dealt with prior to the Domino rezoning, and I am intimately familiar with those mistakes, having read that EIS in depth over a very long period of time. But I guess my question is how? Because what I don't understand about the comprehensive plan and the balance between community engagement and citywide action is, let's say it takes a year to put together the initial comprehensive plan. It then goes before City Council to be passed, which I believe would be its own level of politics, but that's a different scenario. And then it's passed and it's in place for 10 years, right? And then the proposal, as I understand it, and as I read it in the document that you and Councilmember Lander put together, said that any development that falls within that comprehensive plan, there's some kind of expedited process, so I suppose that development doesn't have to go through a new ULURP. So let's say there's a development in Williamsburg on year 2 of the plan, right? And then what you realize after year 2 is that really the displacement, everything that was in the assumed in the original comprehensive plan was really not that accurate. And then in year 6 of the plan, there's another development in the neighborhood that actually fits 100% with the original comprehensive plan, but but doesn't account for the fact that what we realized was that the comprehensive plan didn't plan accurately for the impacts. But that development doesn't have to go through a process because it fits with the original comprehensive plan, it's expedited. So I guess how does that structure help the real problem that you're trying to solve instead of potentially exacerbating it?
In year 10, you would need to revisit, you would need to have a new needs assessment of what's happening in Williamsburg. Right now, there is no assessment that needs to happen related to the rezoning of 2005 in Williamsburg. So whatever happened and the impacts that were incurred by Williamsburg, we just have to deal with it. A comprehensive plan could say, look, we didn't account for this much displacement to happen. There needs to be a more aggressive affordable housing plan that needs to be implemented in Williamsburg to account for the displacement that's happened. We could revisit that and address it in a comprehensive plan in a way we can't do through like spot zoning.
So using your example, it would be readdressing it in a comprehensive plan after both the original rezoning and the Domino sugar impact. It would then be reassessed.
Yes, it would go through that 10-year process, but I want you to put it in perspective to the current timeline. The Domino has only built one building out of the 6 that are supposed to be built in Williamsburg, and they have a 12-year timeline, which means by 2042, they're supposed to be completing all these buildings, and in none of those cases are we going to be able to address any of the impacts that they would produce for the community.
So sorry, that leads me to one more question. So is the idea that if the comprehensive plan changes mid-development project, that development project could then be halted or changed? Because I think the rezoning, you know this better than I do, obviously, the domino rezoning happened within the 10-year window, even if the development itself post-rezoning will go on for, 20 years or whatever.
No, the second rezoning happened, I think it was in 2015, 2016.
Okay.
They were two different rezonings. There was the Williamsburg rezoning.
In 2006.
The domino sugar.
And then there was a Domino Sugar rezoning, which was in 2008 or so. No. Then there was a second Domino's, which was in 2014. 14.
Okay, so when we look at that timeline, that's 9 years. So overall, so the point that I guess that I'm making, yes, it's going to be difficult for us to have like stopgaps within the 10-year period, but there is an opportunity to eventually address the issues that came to bear because of the last comprehensive plan. In this case, there's absolutely no recourse a community could take on from a previous development that happened, no matter how long ago it was. Right now, we just have to deal with whatever we've been dealt with, which in Williamsburg, to be clear, is a 30% reduction in the Latino population. My district is no longer a majority-minority district, and I can be sitting here as the last Latino representing that district in the city council. That's called bad planning, I think.
I would just like to ask a question that is often I look at situations and realize that for much of what we do, not just here, but that the good is the enemy of the great. I've been really listening carefully all night. I've spent my life in planning activities, and it seems as if people are asking for a plan that does all things for all people in all ways.
No.
Wait. I get to talk too.
Okay.
That's what it seems like to me. And that I think, in my experience, we have to really think about what it is we're trying to achieve in a comprehensive plan before we can lay out, if we do, a process of what a comprehensive plan looks like. And so maybe if each one of you could give me 30 seconds on what it is you want to achieve in a plan. Jessica?
No, I think your issue is exactly the one that we're concerned about, is that we don't know what problem the plan is trying to solve.
Mr. Mehta?
The idea behind a comprehensive plan is we don't consider it as something that's be all end all for everything. We see it as a strategic framework that allows for predictability of certain goals that are established. That's why, in London, they've established principles that help guide what the mayor is going to do when he redevelops the plan. And we think that it's a good framework to go forward. So it's not prescriptive, but it allows for moving things forward in a
By non-prescriptive, you mean aspirational?
Aspirational, yes.
Thank you.
I'd like to sort of anchor it in what I hear in many neighborhoods who have done comprehensive community plans and who demand that the city do some comprehensive planning, especially those that have been rezoned. Why is there no coordination with the capital budget? So why do you have a rezoning that postpones planning for schools, daycare centers, parks, open space for some time in the future, or leaves it to vague promises? That's what I think a lot of people mean by comprehensive planning. Let's break it down to those things. It's very concrete. It's not abstract. People are not looking for dreamy views of the future. They're looking for the city to think comprehensively. I discovered this in doing community-based planning for decades. Some people tend to look at the big picture and to look long-term. And some people tend to look very short-term at immediate results. And you know what? Some of them are in city planning offices, and some of them are in communities. There are exclusionary people in city planning offices, and there are exclusionary people in community boards. So what I want people to do is to open their eyes and listen to what people in neighborhoods and communities who are demanding comprehensive planning. This is not coming from the airheads in our universities. This is coming from the grassroots. Why don't you think about all of these long-term consequences when you initiate a rezoning, when you initiate a capital project?
Okay. Thank you. Elena?
Sure. So there are no Pollyannas here, certainly not me, all right? It will not be all things to all people. It will not remove politics, as you named it, earlier tonight, Chair Benjamin. This is inherently political, but we cannot get what we want without aiming for it. So what this will do will create a process that is more transparent, integrated, participatory, aimed at tackling inequality, although it will be imperfectly defined, right, and accountable and aligned with budgeting. That is what it will do.
Carl, what?
I'm sorry, because I go back to the question that I guess first posed by Professor Bean and then posed by several members of this commission, starting with Commissioner Norrie. And I've heard from each of you very, very different notions of what comprehensive planning is. So just in terms of I've heard from Mr. Maida that it's aspirational. I've heard from you, Elena, that it must be prescriptive and that it's got to be actually essentially in law, and that's very different from the London plan, for example. I think what we're all struggling with is this notion of comprehensive planning means so many different things to so many different people that us as a group that's making recommendations for a charter that's to last for a long time and to provide guidance really has not gotten much in the way of guidance, at least consensus on guidance of what that would be. That's just more an observation.
Wait, can I, Antonio, you did not give your 30 seconds.
Do no harm. I just want us to reflect back on what we've done in this city over the last 20 years, many great accomplishments, and I won't take that away from who we are. I'm very proud to be a New Yorker. But where we are going is crisis-level issues, and we need to match the crisis-level issues with the same reaction. And the current planning that we do does not do that. It doesn't allow for us to match that crisis-level issues that we have. So it's a challenge to us to figure this out.
Do you see it as a way to build consensus around the crisis, or is it a way to build responses to the crisis?
I think I would, another thing is, Gail, Carl, you're the foremost minds in planning when it comes to the city of New York. We've yet to, be able to drill into your brains about what you think this can happen. Wait,
you notice Carl. I didn't ask you any questions because I'm going to be sitting there and you're going to be sitting here.
My point is, Carl.
So I'm being very cautious, Councilman.
I hear you, but my point being is that we have work to do. But it concerns me only with how concerned we are. Instead of rising to the challenge, we know we have issues. Imagine the waterfront being fixed community by community by community, not just dealt with in one real thoughtful way across the city of New York. We can't allow for us to go through this process. We are going to be in big trouble, and I just want to meet it with that same type of urgency.
Chair Benjamin, may I respond to Commissioner Weisbrod briefly?
Very briefly.
Okay. Professor Bean's point is a real point. I don't think we have that difference here, but I think we define it and then we do it. What I heard tonight is a moving target for why we can't attempt this. Oh, it's too hard. Oh, we're in too much of a crisis to actually do any planning. Oh, but actually we're doing such a great job. Everything is working fine. And that is not, all three of those things can't be true, right, as reasons why we can't do this. And I just want to say that you cannot run participatory processes that are split in 7 different efforts and actually expect them to be participatory, right? The current way that we are satisfying the requirement for a comprehensive plan is not that. And so let's use our great New York imaginations and our great New York expertise to challenge it.
Can I
Carl?
I don't want to, it's the purpose of these meetings is to elicit information and not debate, but yes, we've heard a lot of things about the challenges of a comprehensive plan. And I think everyone would agree that we hardly do planning perfectly. It's an imperfect, we live in a very dynamic city. It's really hard, and there's always room for improvement. My concern is that I really did hear very, very different things from each of you as to what your idea of a comprehensive plan is. And I think that's the issue that I think we're, at least for me, I'm struggling with. I certainly accept the objective that you all have, that I certainly share, that we should do a better job of planning. You know, we're never, as Chair Benjamin said, we are not perfect by any means, but you know, to wrap the word comprehensive around it as if that will solve the challenge when each of you and many others have somewhat different ideas of what it means, I think is the issue we struggle with.
Jim?
Could I respond?
Wait. Jim?
Thank you. I've been really quiet, and in part because these 2 panels have made my head hurt. not in a bad way. I'm not trying to insult anyone. I'm just saying there's so much to think about and so many different consequences to think about. So I don't know if I'm allowed to give homework assignments, but, you know, it sounds to me like, you know, that people are right, that having 7 different documents doing 7 different things, changed by every mayor who comes in, is not the right way to go. But at the same time, I hear people here saying, you know, it's got to be from the ground up. We have to start with community plans, or we can't have 27 different community plans for the waterfront. We need one plan. You know, I do hear, so if maybe people could talk to each other and come back to us in the next couple weeks with some ideas about how binding should this be and how top-down, bottom-up, what would a process look like? And is there a way to sort of integrate what we're doing now with a fair share component to all of it put in?
Boy, you're really adding to the...
No, and you know, maybe that's where we should end up. But, you know, anyway, my head hurts. But thank you all.
I think I applaud the use of Seattle as an example, because I think there is a concrete example of how it works in a real city in the United States. And is that the way it's going to work in New York City? No. But it's a demonstration of what can be done and what I think should be done in New York City. Why not? I just want to end by saying I was on a panel recently with Alex Garvin, who usually disagrees with me on everything. And we wound up agreeing thoroughly that there was a lack of foresight and vision in New York City when it comes to infrastructure, when it comes to capital budget. And he said, restore capital budget responsibility to the city planning department. Well, that was his idea of a first step, and it could be a very first step, but it has to be more than that, or it's going to be taken away again.
Okay, Sal, and then
Yeah.
I think that's it, unless you have a response, Howard?
Just quickly, I get the gist of what comprehensive planning means. I mean, there are different permutations, but I think in our heads, it means planning ahead. It means having a vision for the city. And I think we're not going to get that here tonight, but this is a information gathering process. And I think at the end of it, hopefully with your help and the help of others, if we plan on going in that direction, we'll get it crystallized.
Plan on going in that direction? Do we need a plan for that?
That's a short-range plan. Professor Angotti says we've got short range, long range. But I think that this is very valuable. The feedback's great, and I hope that we can come up with something concrete as we move ahead. Thank you.
I think that's it. And I'd like to thank the panelists. I think it was a really great discussion. I hope you thought so too, and I hope you're willing to be more involved with us as we continue down the road of investigating the possibilities here. If any of you would like to further engage or would like to send us written comments or testimony about your thoughts about either the last question or any of the questions about what a comprehensive plan in your mind would look like, or alternately, what you would envision the charter saying about a comprehensive plan. Just there shall be one, and laying out how that would later be decided. So there are a lot of things we'd love to hear from you. I mean, in one 45-minute or hour session, we can't really get to all of the questions that people have or the ways in which people might want to engage. But I hope you see that we would like to engage, and that we want to hear both from you and from city planning about both the practical and the real, because those are real too. So Howard, I hope you'll also tell us what you think. And with that, is there anything? Carl, is that your hand up? Are you ready to second the...
A motion?
Is there a motion to adjourn?
Yes. Okay.
Is there a second?
Yes, there is.
Any discussion? All in favor? Opposed? I will see you all next Monday. You too.
Good job. Yeah. Let me know anything.